Chapter 18. When Robert Ferguson came in to luncheon the next day, he asked for Elizabeth. "She hasn't come home yet from Nanny's," Miss White told him. "I thought she would be here immediately after breakfast. I can't imagine what keeps her, though I suppose they have a great deal to talk over." "Well, she'll have to wait for her good news," Mr. Ferguson said, and handed a telegram to Miss White. "Dispatch from David. He's bringing a patient across the mountains tonight. Says he'll turn up here for breakfast. He'll have to go back on the 10 o'clock train, though." Cherry Pie nibbled with excitement. "I guess he just had to come and talk the arrangements over with her." "What arrangements?" Mr. Ferguson asked, vaguely, when reminded by Miss White. He looked a little startled. "Oh, to be sure, I had forgotten." Then he smiled. "Well, I suppose I shall have to say, yes, I think I'll go east myself next week," he added, fatuously, but the connection was not obvious to Miss White. "Elizabeth got a letter from him yesterday," she said, beaming. "They've decided on her birthday, if you are willing." "Willing? I guess it's a case of, he had to be resigned," said Robert Ferguson, thinking of that trip east. He was positively gay. But Cherry Pie's romance lapsed into household concerns. "We must have something the boy likes for breakfast." "Looking at Elizabeth will be all the breakfast he wants," Elizabeth's uncle said, with his meager chuckle. "David's as big a donkey as any of 'em, though he hasn't the gift of gab on the subject." When he had gone to his office, Miss White propped the telegram up on the table, so that Elizabeth's eyes might brighten the moment she opened the front door, but to her dismay, Elizabeth did not open the door all that afternoon. Instead came a note, plainly in her hand, addressed to Mr. Ferguson. "Why, she is sending word that she's going to stay all night again with Nanny," Miss White thought, really disturbed. If such a thing had been possible, Cherry Pie would have been vexed with her beloved lamb, for after all, Elizabeth really ought to be at home attending to things. Miss White herself had spent every minute since the wonderful news had been flung at her, in attending to things. She had made a list of the people who must be invited to the wedding, she had inspected the china closet, she had calculated how many teaspoons would be needed. "Better borrow some forks from Nanny, too," she said, beginning, like every good housekeeper, to look careworn. "There's so much to be done," said Cherry Pie, excitedly. Yet this scatter-brained girl evidently meant to stay away from home still another night. "Well, she can't, that's all there is to it," Miss White said, decidedly. "She must come home, so as to be here in the morning when David arrives. Perhaps I'd better go down to Mrs. Maitland's and take her the dispatch." She was getting ready to go, when the first rumble of the hurricane made itself heard. Nanny dropped in, and, "Where's Elizabeth?" "I'm sure I don't know. Isn't she at home? Stayed with me last night." "Why, no, she didn't. I haven't seen Elizabeth for 2 days, and—" Nanny sprang to catch poor old Miss White, who reeled, and then tried, as she sank into a chair, to speak. "What? What, not with you last night?" "Nanny, she must have been. She told me she was going." Miss White grew so ghastly that Nanny, in a panic, called a servant. "Send for her uncle." The poor lady stammered. Send. "Oh, what has happened to my child?" Then she remembered the letter addressed to Mr. Ferguson, lying on the table beside David's telegram. "Perhaps that will say where she is. Oh, tell him to hurry." When Robert Ferguson reached home, he found the 2 pallid, shaking women waiting for him in the hall. Miss White, clutching that unopened letter, tried to tell him Elizabeth had not been at Nanny's, she had not come home, she had. "Give me the letter," he said. They watched him tear it open and run his eye over it. The next instant he had gone into his library and slammed the door in their faces. Outside in the hall, the trembling women looked at each other in silence. Then Nanny said with a gasp, "She must have gone to some friends. She has no friend she would stay all night with but you." "Well, you see, she has written to Mr. Ferguson, so there can't be anything much the matter. He'll tell us where she is, in a minute. If he can't, I'll make Blair go and look for her." Dear Miss White, don't cry. There has been an accident." "Oh, how shall we tell David?" "He's coming tomorrow to talk over the wedding, and—" The library door opened. "Miss White." "Mr. Ferguson." "Where? What?" "Miss White, that creature is never to cross my threshold again. Do you understand me? Never again." Nanny, your brother is a scoundrel. Read that. He flung the letter on the floor between them and went back to his library. They heard the key turn in the lock. Miss White stared at the shut door blankly. Nanny picked up the letter. It was headed, "The Mayor's Office," and was dated the day before. No address was given. "Dear Uncle Robert, I married Blair Maitland this afternoon. David did not want me. E.F." They read it, looked at each other with astounded eyes, then read it again. Nanny was the first to find words. "I don't understand." Miss White was dumb, her poor upper lip quivered wildly. "She and David are to be married," Nanny stammered. "How can she marry anybody else? I don't understand." Then Miss White broke out, "I understand. Oh, wicked boy. My child, my lamb. He has killed my child Elizabeth." "Who has? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "He has lured her away from David," the old woman wailed shrilly. Nanny, your brother is an evil, cruel man, a false friend." "Oh, my lamb, my girl." Nanny, staring at her with horrified eyes, was silent. Miss White sank down on the floor, her head on the lowest step of the staircase. She was moaning to herself. They quarreled about something, and this is what she has done. Oh, she was mad, my lamb, my poor lamb. She was crazy. David made her angry. I don't know how. And she did this frightful thing. Oh, I always knew she would do some terrible thing when she was angry. Nanny looked at the closed door of the library, then at Miss White, lying there, crying and moaning to herself with her poor old head on the stairs. Once she tried to speak, but Miss White did not hear her. It was intolerable to see such pain. Blair's sister, ashamed with his shame, stammered something, she did not know what, then opening the front door, slipped out into the dusk. The situation was so incredible she could not take it in. Blair and Elizabeth married? She kept saying it over and over. But it was impossible. Elizabeth was to marry David on her birthday. I feel as if I were going out of my mind. Nanny told herself, hurrying down into Mercer's black, noisy heart. When she reached the squalor of Maitland's shanty town and saw the great old house on the farther side of the street, looming up on its graded embankment, black against a smoldering red sunset, she was almost sobbing aloud, and when Harris answered her ring, she was in such tension that she burst out at him. "Harris? Where is Mr. Blair? Do you know? Have you heard anything?" She seized the old man's arm and held on to it. "Where is Mr. Blair, Harris?" "My laws, Miss Nanny. How do I know? Ain't he at the hotel? There's a letter come for you. It come just after you went out. Looks like it was from him. There, now, child. Don't you take on like that. I guess if Mr. Blair can write letters, there ain't much wrong with him." When he brought her the letter, she made him wait there in the dimly lighted hall until she opened it. She had a feeling that she could not read it by herself. "Oh, Harris," she said, and began to tremble. "It's true. He did. They are, oh, Harris." And while the old man drew her into the parlor, and scuffled about to light the gas and bring her a glass of water, she told him, brokenly, she had to tell somebody what had happened. Harris's ejaculations were of sheer amazement, untouched by disapproval. "Mr. Blair? Married to Miss Elizabeth? My land. There. He always did get in ahead." His astounded chuckle was as confusing as all the rest of it. Nanny, standing under the single flaring jet of gas, read the letter again. It was, at any rate, more enlightening than Elizabeth's to her uncle. "Dear Nanny, don't have a fit when I tell you Elizabeth and I are married. She had a row with David, and broke her engagement with him. We were married this afternoon. I'm afraid Mother won't like it, because, I admit, it's rather sudden. But really it is the easiest way all round, especially for other people. It's on the principle of having your tooth pulled quick, if you have to have it pulled, instead of by degrees. I'll amount to something, now, and that will please Mother. You tell her that I will amount to something now. I want you to tell her about it before I write to her myself, which, of course, I shall do tomorrow, because it will be easier for her to have it come from you. Tell her marrying Elizabeth will make a businessman of me. You must tell her as soon as you get this, because probably it will be in the newspapers. I feel like a cur, asking you to break it to her, because, of course, it's sort of difficult. She won't like it, just at first. She never likes anything I do. But it will be easier for her to hear it first from you. Oh, you dear old Nancy, I am nearly out of my head, I'm so happy. P.S. We are going off for a month or so. I'll let you know where to address us when I know myself. Nanny dropped down into a chair and tried to get her wits together. If Elizabeth had broken with David, why, then, of course, she could marry Blair, but why should she marry him right away? It isn't decent, said Nanny. And when did she break with David? Only day before yesterday she was expecting to marry him. It is horrible, said Nanny, and her recoil of disgust for a moment included Blair. But the habit of love made her instant with excuses. It's worse in Elizabeth than in him. Mama will say so, too. Then she felt a shock of terror. Mama. She smoothed out the letter, crumpled in her shaking hand, and read it again. I want you to tell her. Oh, I can't. Nanny said, it will be easier for her to have it come from you, and what about me? She thought, with sudden, unwanted bitterness, it won't be easy for me. She began to take off her things, then realized that she was shivering. The few minutes of stirring the fire which was smoldering under a great lump of coal between the brass jambs of the grate, gave her the momentary relief of occupation, but when she sat down in the shifting firelight, and held her trembling hands toward the blaze, the shame and fright came back again. Poor David, she said, but even as she said it she defended her brother. If Elizabeth had broken with him, of course Blair had a right to marry her. But how could Elizabeth? I can never forgive her. Nanny thought, wincing with disgust. To be engaged to David one day, and marry Blair the next. Oh, Blair ought not to have done it, she said, involuntarily, and hid her face in her hands. But it was so intolerable to her to blame him, that she drove her mind back to Elizabeth's vulgarity. She could bear what had happened if she thought of Blair as a victim and not as an offender. I can never feel the same to Elizabeth again, she said. Then she remembered what her brother had bidden her do, and quailed. For a moment she was actually sick with panic. Then she, too, knew the impulse to get the tooth pulled quick. She got up and went swiftly across the hall to the dining room. It was empty, except for Harris, who was moving some papers from the table to set it for supper. Oh, Harris, she said, with a gasp of relief, she isn't here. Harris. I have got to tell her. You don't think she'll mind much, do you? But by this time Harris's chuckling appreciation of Mr. Blair's cleverness in getting in ahead had evaporated. My, Miss Nanny, he said, his weak blue eyes blinking with fright, I wouldn't tell her, not if you'd give me the works. Harris, if you were in my place, would you try to, at supper? Now, miss, how can I tell? She'll be wild, my, wild. I don't see why. Mr. Blair had a right to get married. He'd ought to have let on to her about it, Harris said. For a few minutes Nanny was stricken dumb. Then she sought encouragement again. Perhaps if you had something nice for supper, she'd be pleased, you know, and take it better. There's to be cabbage. Maybe that will soften her up. She likes it. Gor, how she likes cabbage, said Harris, almost weeping. Harris, how do you think she'll take it? She won't take it well, the old man said. Miss Elizabeth was Mr. David's girl. When I come to think it over, I don't take it well myself, Miss Nanny. No, you don't, neither. No, she won't take it well. But Miss Elizabeth had broken with Mr. David. Nanny defended her brother. Mr. Blair had a right, then she shivered. But I've got to tell her. Oh, Harris, I think she wouldn't mind so much, if he told her himself? Harris considered. Yes, miss, she would. Mr. Blair don't put things right to his ma. He'd say something she wouldn't like. He'd say something about some of his pretty truck. Them things always make her mad. That picture he bought, the lady nursing the baby, in your parlor, she ain't got over that yet. Oh, no, she'll take it better from you. You be pretty with her, Miss Nanny. She likes it when you're pretty with her. I once seen a chippy sittin' on a cowcatcher. Well, it made me think, oh, you and her. You be pretty to her, and then tell her, kind of easy, Harris ended weakly. Easy. It was all very well to say, easy. Harris might as well say knock her down, easy. At that moment the back door banged. Mrs. Maitland burst into the room in intense preoccupation. The day had been one of absorbing interest, culminating in success, and she was alert with satisfaction. Harris. Supper. Nanny, take my bonnet. Is your brother to be here tonight? I've something to tell him. Where's the evening paper? Nanny, breathless, took the forlorn old bonnet, and said, I think he isn't coming, Mama. Harris came running with the newspaper. They exchanged a frightened glance, although the mistress of the house, with one hand on the carving knife, was already saying, "Bless, O Lord." At supper Mrs. Maitland, eating, as the grocer said so long ago, like a day laborer, read her paper. Nanny, watching her, ate nothing at all and said nothing at all. When the coarse, hurried meal was at an end, and Harris, blinking with horrified sympathy, had shut himself into his pantry, Nanny said, faintly, "Mama, I have something to tell you. I guess it will keep, my dear, I guess it will keep. I'm too busy just now to talk to you." She crumpled up her newspaper, flung it on the floor, and plunged over to her desk. Nanny looked helplessly at the back of her head, then went off to her parlor. She sat there in the firelit darkness, too distracted and frightened to light the gas, planning how the news must be told. At 8 o'clock there was a fluttering, uncertain ring at the front door, and Cherry Pie came quivering in. Had Nanny heard anything more? Did she know where they were? I asked her uncle to come down here and see if Mrs. Maitland had heard anything, but he was dreadful, Nanny, dreadful. He said he would see the whole family in. I can't repeat where he said he would see them. She broke down and cried. Then, crouching at Nanny's side, she read Blair's letter by the uncertain light of the fire. After that, except for occasional whispered ejaculations of terror and pain, they were silent, sitting close together like two frightened birds. Sometimes a lump of coal split apart, or a hissing jet of gas bubbled and flamed between the bars of the grate, and then their two shadows flickered gigantic on the wall behind them. But except for that, the room was very still. When the older woman rose to go, Nanny clung to her. "Oh, won't you tell her? Please, please." Poor old Miss White could only shake her head. "I can't, my dear, I can't. It would not be fitting. Do it now, my dear, do it immediately, and get it over." When Cherry Pie had wavered back into the night, Nanny gathered up her courage to get it over. She went stealthily across the hall, but at the dining room door she stood still, her hand on the knob, not daring to enter. Strangely enough, in the midst of the absorbing distress of the moment, some trick of memory made her think of the little, frayed cat, standing outside that door, trying to find the courage to open it and get for Blair, for whose sake she stood there now, the money for his journey all around the world. In spite of her terror, she smiled faintly. Then she opened the door and looked in. Mrs. Maitland was still at work, and she retreated noiselessly. At 11 she tried again. Except for the single gas jet under a green shade that hung above the big desk, the room was dark. Mrs. Maitland was in her chair, writing rapidly. She did not hear Nanny's hesitating footstep, or know that she was in the room, until the girl put her hand on the arm of her chair. "Mama." "Yes?" "Mama, I have something to tell you." Mrs. Maitland signed her name, put her pen behind her ear, flung a blotter down on the heavily written page, and rubbed her fist over it. "Well?" she said cheerfully, and glanced up at her stepdaughter over her steel-rimmed spectacles, with kind eyes. "What are you awake for, at this hour?" Then she drew out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write, "My dear sir, yours received, and con. Mama, Blair is married." The pen made a quick, very slight upward movement. There was a spatter of ink. Then the powerful, beautiful hand went on evenly, tense noted. She rubbed the blotter over this line, put the pen in a cup of shot, and turned around. "What did you say?" I said, "Blair is married." Silence. "He asked me to tell you." Silence. "He hopes you will not be angry. He says he is going to be a tremendous businessman, now, because he is so happy." Silence. Then, in a loud voice, "How long has this been going on?" "Oh, Mama, not any time at all, truly. I am perfectly sure it was on the spur of the moment." "Married, on the spur of the moment? Good God. I only mean he hasn't been planning it. He. And what kind of woman has married him, on the spur of the moment?" "Oh, Mama." Her voice was so terrified that Mrs. Maitland suddenly looked at her. "Don't be frightened, Nanny," she said kindly. "What is it? You have something more to tell me, I can see that. Come, out with it. Is she bad?" "Oh, Mama, don't. She is Elizabeth." Then she fled. That night, at about 2 o'clock, Mrs. Maitland entered her stepdaughter's room. Nanny was dozing, but started up in her bed, her heart in her throat at the sight of the gaunt figure standing beside her. Blair's mother had a candle in one hand, and the other was curved about it to protect the bending flame from the draft of the open door. The light flickered up on her face, and Nanny was conscious of how deep the wrinkles were on her forehead and about her mouth. "Nanny, tell me everything." She put the candle on the table at the head of the bed, and sat down, leaning forward a little, as if a weight were resting on her shoulders. Her clasped hands, hanging loosely between her knees, seemed, in the faint light of the small, pointed flame, curiously shrunken and withered. "Tell me," she said heavily. Nanny told her all she knew. It was little enough. "How do you know that Elizabeth had broken with David Ritchie?" her stepmother said. Nanny silently handed her Blair's letter. Mrs. Maitland took up her candle, and holding it close to the flimsy sheet, read her son's statement. Then she handed it back. "I see, some sort of a squabble, and Blair," she stopped, almost with a groan. "His friend," she said, and her chin shook. "Your father's son," she said brokenly. "Mama," Nanny protested. She was sitting up in bed, her hair in its two braids falling over her white nightdress, her eyes, so girlish, so frightened, fixed on that quivering iron face. "Mama. Remember, he was in love with Elizabeth long ago, before David ever thought." "In love with Elizabeth? He was never in love with anybody but himself." "Oh, Mama, please forgive him. It's done now, and it can't be undone." "What has my forgiveness got to do with it? It's done, as you say. It can't be undone. Nothing can be undone. Nothing, nothing. All the years that remain cannot undo the years that I have been building this up." Nanny stared at her blankly. And suddenly the hard face softened. "Lie down. Go to sleep." She put her big roughened hand gently on the girl's head. "Go to sleep, my child." She took up her candle, and a moment later Nanny heard the stairs creak under her heavy tread. Sarah Maitland did not sleep that night, but after the first outburst, when Nanny had panted out, "It is Elizabeth," and then fled, there had been no anger. When the door closed behind her stepdaughter, Blair's mother put her hand over her eyes and sat perfectly still at her desk. Blair was married, and he had not told her. That was the first thought. Then, into the pitiful, personal dismay of mortification and wounded love, came the sword thrust of a second thought: he had stolen his friend's wife. It was not a moment for nice discriminations. The fact that Elizabeth had not been married to David seemed immaterial. This was because, to Sarah Maitland's generation, the word, in this matter of getting married, was so nearly as good as the bond, that a broken engagement was always a solemn, and generally a disgraceful thing. So, when she said that Blair had stolen David's wife, she cringed with shame. What would his father say to such conduct? In what had she been wanting that Herbert's son could disgrace his father's name and hate his mother? For of course he must hate her to shut her out of his life, and not tell her he was going to get married. Her mind seemed to oscillate between the abstraction of his dishonor and a more intimate and primitive pain, the sense of personal slight. "Oh, my son, my son, my son," she said. She was bending over, her elbows on her knees, her furrowed forehead resting on her clenched hands. Her whole big body quivered. He had shut her out. He hated her. He had never loved her. My son, my son. Then a sharp return of memory to the shame of his conduct whipped her to her feet and set her walking about the room. It was long after midnight before she said to herself that the first thing to do was to learn exactly what had happened. Nanny must tell her. It was then that she went up to her stepdaughter's room. When Nanny had told her, or rather when Blair's letter had made the thing shamefully clear, she went downstairs and faced the situation. Who was responsible for it? Who was to blame? Before she could add, in her mind, Elizabeth or Blair? Some trick of memory finished her question. Who was to blame, this man or his parents? The suggestion of personal responsibility was like a blow in the face. She flinched under it, and sat down abruptly, breathing hard. How could it be possible that she was to blame? What had she left undone that other mothers did? She had loved him. No mother could have loved him more than she did, and he had never cared for her love. In what had she been lacking? He had had a religious bringing up. She had begun to take him to church when he was 4 years old. He had had every educational opportunity. All that he wanted he had had. She had never stinted him in anything. Could any mother have done more? Could Herbert himself have done more? No, she could not reproach herself for lack of love. She had loved him, so that she had spared him everything, even desire. All that he could want was his before he could ask for it. In the midst of this angry justifying of herself, tramping up and down the long room, she stopped suddenly and looked about her. Where was her knitting? Her thoughts were in such a distracted tangle that the accustomed automatic movement of her fingers was imperative. She tucked the grimy pink ball of zephyr under her arm, and tightening her fingers on the bent and yellowing old needles, began again her fierce pacing up and down, up and down. But the room seemed to cramp her, and by she went across the hall into Nanny's parlor, where the fire had sprung into cheerful flames. Here she paused for a while, standing with one foot on the fender, knitting rapidly, her unseeing eyes fixed on the needles. Yes, Blair had had no cares, no responsibilities, and as for money. With a wave of resentment, she thought that she would find out in the morning from her bookkeeper just how much money she had given him since he was 21. It was then that a bleak consciousness, like the dull light of a winter dawn, slowly began to take possession of her. Money. She had given him money, but what else had she given him? Not companionship. She had never had the time for that. Besides, he would not have wanted it. She knew, inarticulately, that he and she had never spoken the same language. Not sympathy in his endless futilities. What intelligent person could sympathize with a man who found serious occupation in buying, well, china beetles? Or pictures? She glanced angrily over at that piece of blackened canvas by the door, its gold frame glimmering faintly in the firelight. He had spent $5,000 on a picture that you could cover with your two hands. Yes, she had given him money, but that was all she had given him. Money was apparently the only thing they had in common. Then came another surge of resentment, that pitiful resentment of the wounded heart. Blair had never cared how hard she worked to make money for him. It occurred to her, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she worked very hard. She said to herself that sometimes she was tired. Yes, she had never thought of it before, but she was sometimes very tired. But what did Blair care for that? What did he care how hard she worked? Even as she said it, with that anger which is a confession of something deeper than anger, her mind retorted that if he had never cared how hard she worked for their money, she had never cared how easily he spent it. She had been irritated by his way of spending it, and she had been contemptuous, but she had never really cared. So it appeared that they did not have even money in common. The earning had been all hers, the spending had been all his. If she had liked to buy gimcracks, they would have had that in common, and perhaps he would have been fond of her. But I never knew how to be a fool, she thought, simply. Yes, she didn't know how to spend, she only knew how to earn. Of course, if he had had to earn what he spent, they would have had work as a bond of sympathy. Work. Blair had never understood that work was the finest thing in the world. She wondered why he had not understood it, when she herself had worked so hard, worked, in fact, so that he might be beyond the need of working. As she said that, her fingers were suddenly rigid on her needles. It seemed as if her soul had felt a jolt of dismay. Why didn't her son understand the joy of work? Because she had spared him all necessity for it, for the work she had given him to do was not real, and they both knew it. Spared him? Robbed him? Who hath sinned, this man or his parents? This man, her selfish, indolent, dishonorable son, or she herself, whose hurry to possess the one thing she wanted, that finest thing in the world, work, had pushed him into the road of pleasant, shameful idleness, the road that always leads to dishonor? Good God, what a fool she had been not to make him work. Sarah Maitland, tramping back and forth, the ball of pink worsted dragging behind her in a grimy tangle, thought these things with a sledgehammer directness that spared herself nothing. She wanted the truth, no matter how it made her cringe to find it. She would hammer out her very heart to find the truth. And the truth she found was that she had never allowed Blair to meet the negations of life, to meet those no's which teach the eternal affirmations of character. He had had everything, he had done nothing. The result was as inevitable as the action of a law of nature. In the illuminating misery of this terrible night, she saw that she had given her son, as Robert Ferguson had said to her once, fullness of bread and abundance of idleness. And now she was learning what bread and idleness together must always make of a man. Walking up and down the dimly lighted room, she had a vision of her sin that made her groan. She had made Blair what he was, because it had been easy for her to make things easy for him. She had given him his heart's desire, and brought leanness withal to his soul. In satisfying her own hunger for work, she had forgotten to give it to him, and he had starved for it. She had left, by this time, far behind her the personal affront to her of his reserves. She took meekly the knowledge that he did not love her. She even thought of his marriage as unimportant, or as important only because it was a symptom of a condition for which she was responsible. And having once realized and accepted this fact, there was only one solemn question in her mind. What am I going to do about it? For she believed, as other parents have believed before her, and probably will go on believing as long as there are parents and sons, she believed that she could, in some way or other, by the very strength of her agonizing love, force into her son's soul from the outside that kingdom of God which must be within. Oh, what am I going to do? She said to herself. She stood still and covered her face with her hands. God, she said, don't punish him. It's my fault, punish me. Perhaps she had never really prayed before. Chapter 19. Robert Ferguson, in his library, and poor Miss White in the hall, listened with tense nerves for the wheels of the carriage that was to bring David Ritchie to breakfast. Send him in to me, Mr. Ferguson had said, and then had shut himself into his library. Miss White was quivering with terror when at last she heard the carriage door bang. David came leaping up the steps, his face rosy as a girl's in the raw morning air. It was a lowering Mercer morning, with the street lamps burning at 8 o'clock in a murk of smoke and fog. He raked the windows with a smiling glance, and then stood, laughing for sheer happiness, waiting for her to open the door to him. David had had a change of spirit, if not of mind, since he wrote his eminently sensible letter to Elizabeth. He had been able to scrape up enough money of his own to pay at least one of his bills, and things had gone better with him at the hospital, so he no longer felt the unreasonable humiliation which Elizabeth's proposal had accentuated in him. The reproach which his mood had read into her letter had vanished after a good night's sleep and a good day's work. Now, it seemed to him only an exquisite expression of most lovely love, which brought the color into his face, and made his lips burn at the thought of her lips. Of course her idea of marrying on her little money was not to be thought of. He and Mr. Ferguson would laugh over it together, but what an angel she was to think of it. All that night, in the journey over the mountains, he had lain in his berth and looked out at the stars, cursing himself joyously for a dumb fool who had had no words to tell her how he loved her for that sweet, divinely foolish proposal, which was not to be thought of. But when I see her, I'll make her understand. When I hold her in my arms, he told himself, with all the passion of 26 years which had no easy outlet of speech. When Robert Ferguson's door opened, his heart was on his lips. Elise, he began, and stopped short. Oh, Miss White. Good morning, Miss White. And before poor Cherry Pie knew it, he had given her a great hug. Where is Elizabeth? Not out of bed yet? Oh, the lazy bones. He was so eager that, until he was fairly in the hall, with the front door shut, and his overcoat almost off, he did not notice her silence. Then he gave her a startled look. Miss White, is anything the matter? Is Elizabeth ill? No. Oh, no, she said breathlessly, but Mr. Ferguson will tell you. No, she is not sick. Go, he will tell you. In the library. The color dropped out of his face as a flag drops to half-mast. She is dead, he said, with absolute finality in his voice. When did she die? He stood staring straight ahead of him at the wall, ghastly with fright. No, no, she is not dead, she is well. Quite well, oh, very well. Go, David, my dear boy, oh, my dear boy. Go to Mr. Ferguson. He will tell you. But it is terrible, David. He went, dazed, and saying, why, but what is it? If she is not. Robert Ferguson met him on the threshold of the library, drew him in, closed the door, and looked him full in the face. No, she isn't dead, he said, I wish to God she were. Then he struck him hard on the shoulder. David, he said harshly, be a man, they've played a damned dirty trick on you. Yesterday she married Blair Maitland. Take it like a man, and be thankful you are rid of her. He wheeled about and stood with his back to his niece's lover. He had guided the inevitable sword, but he could not witness the agony of the wound. There was complete stillness in the room. The ticking of the clock suddenly hammered in Robert Ferguson's ears. A cinder fell softly from the grate. Then he heard a long-drawn breath. Tell me, if you please, exactly what has happened. Elizabeth's uncle, still with his back turned, told him what little he knew. I don't know where they are, he ended. I don't want to know. The scoundrel wrote to Nanny, but he gave no address. Elizabeth's letter to me is on my table. Read it. He heard David move over to the library table. He heard the rustle of the sheet of paper as it was drawn out of the envelope. Then silence again, and the clamor of the clock. He turned round, in time to see David stagger slightly and drop into a chair. Perspiration had burst out on his forehead. He was so white around his lips that Robert Ferguson knew that for a moment his body shared the awful astonishment of his soul. There's some whiskey over there, he said, nodding toward a side table. David shook his head. Then, still shuddering with that dreadful sickness, he spoke. She has married Blair? Blair, he repeated, uncomprehendingly. He put his hand up to his head with that strange, cosmic gesture which horrified humanity has made ever since it was capable of feeling horror. Yes, Mr. Ferguson said grimly. Yes, Blair, your friend. Well, you are not the first man who has had a sweetheart and a friend, a wife, even, and a friend, and then discovered that he had neither wife nor friend. Damn him. Damn him, said David, and burst into a scream of laughter. He was on his feet now, but he rocked a little on his shaking legs. Damnation is too good for him. May God, in the outburst of fury that followed, even Robert Ferguson quailed and put up a protesting hand. David, he stammered, actually recoiling before that storm of words. David, he will get what he deserves. She was worthless. David stopped short. At the mention of Elizabeth, his hurricane of rage dropped suddenly into the flat calm of absolute bewilderment. Do not speak of Elizabeth in that way, in my presence, he said, panting. She is her mother's daughter. She is bad, through and through. She. Stop. David cried, violently. What in hell do you keep on saying that for? I will not listen, I will not hear. He was beside himself. He did not know what he said. But Robert Ferguson was silenced. When David spoke again, it was in gasps, and his words came thickly as if his tongue were numb. What are we to do? Do? There is nothing to do, that I can see. She must be taken away from him. Nobody knows where they are. But if I did know, I wouldn't lift my hand to get her away. She has made her bed, she can lie in it, so far as I am concerned. But she didn't, David groaned. You don't understand. I am the one to curse, not Elizabeth. What are you talking about? I did it. The older man looked at him with almost contemptuous incredulity. My dear fellow, what is the use of denying facts? You can't make black white, can you? Day before yesterday you loved this, he seemed to search for some epithet, glanced at David, and said, almost meekly, girl. Day before yesterday she expected to marry you. Today she is the wife of another man. Have you committed any crime in the last 3 days which justifies that? Yes, David said, in a smothered voice, I have. Then he handed back to the shamed and angry man the poor, pitiful little letter. Don't you see? She says. David didn't want, he broke off, unable to speak. A moment later he added, she isn't used to the other, yet, he said, again with that bewildered look. But Elizabeth's uncle was too absorbed in his own humiliation to see confession in that tragic initial. What is that nonsense about your not wanting her? She thought so. She had reason to think so. You had better explain yourself, David. She wrote to me, David said, after a pause. She told me she would have that money of hers on her birthday. She said we could be married then. He reddened to his temples. She asked me to marry her that day, asked me, you understand. He turned on his heel and went over to the window. He stood there for some minutes with his back to Robert Ferguson. The green door in the wall between the two gardens was swinging back and forth on sagging hinges. David watched it with unseeing eyes. Suddenly a sooty pigeon came circling down and lit just inside the older board, which was choked with snow shoveled from the flagstones of the path. Who can say why, watching the pigeon's teetering walk on the soot-specked snow, David should smell the fragrance of heliotrope hot in the sunshine, and see Elizabeth drawing Blair's ring from her soft young bosom? He turned back to her uncle, with a rigid face. Well, I said no to her letter. Do you understand? I told her no, to a girl like Elizabeth. Because, in my filthy pride, he paused, picked up a book, turned it over, and then put it straight edge to edge with the table. His hand was trembling violently. When he could speak again it was in a whisper. My cursed pride. I didn't want to marry until I could do everything. I wasn't willing to be under obligations. I told her so. I said, no, it made her angry. It would make any girl angry, but Elizabeth. Why, she used to bite herself when she was angry. When she is angry, she will do anything. She has done it. My God. Robert Ferguson could not look at him. He made a pretense of taking up some papers from his desk, and somehow or other got himself out of the room. He found Miss White in the hall, clasping and unclasping her little thin old hands. How did he? She tried to say, but her poor nibbling lip could not finish the question. How does a man usually take a stab in the back? He flung at her. Don't be a. He stopped short. I beg your pardon, Miss White. But she was too heartbroken to resent the rudeness of his suffering. After that they stood there waiting, without speaking to each other. Once Mr. Ferguson made as if he would go back to the library, but stopped with his hand on the doorknob. Once Miss White said brokenly, the boy must have some breakfast, but still they left him to himself. After a while, Cherry Pie sat down on the stairs and cried softly. Robert Ferguson walked about, now out to the front door, with a feint of looking at the thermometer in the vestibule, now the length of the hall, into which the fog had crept until the gas burned in a hazy ring, now into the parlor, from which he instantly fled as if a serpent had stung him. Her little basket of embroidery, overflowing with its pretty foolishness, stood on the table. When David Ritchie opened the library door and came into the hall, he was outwardly far steadier than they. I think I'll go to the depot now, sir. No, thank you, Miss White. I'll get something to eat there. Oh, but my dear boy, she said, trying to swallow her tears. Now don't, I can have your breakfast ready immediately, and... Let him alone, Mr. Ferguson said. He'll eat when he feels like it. David, must you go back this morning? I wish you'd stay. I have to go back, thank you, sir. You may find a letter from her at home. She didn't know you were to be here today. I may, David said, and some dull note in his voice told Robert Ferguson that the young man's youth was over. My boy, he said, forget her. You are well rid of. He stopped short, with an apprehensive glance, but David made no protest. Apparently he was not listening. I shall take the express, he said. I must see my mother before I go to the hospital tonight. She must be told. She will be sorry. Your mother, said Robert Ferguson. Well, David, thank God you have loved one woman who is good. I have loved two women who are good, David said. He turned and took Miss White's poor old, shaking hands in his. When she comes back? Comes back? The older man cried out, furiously. She shall never come back to this house. David did not notice him. Miss White, listen. When you see her, tell her I understand. Just tell her, David says, I understand. And Miss White, say, he says, try to forgive him. She sobbed so, that instinctively, but without tenderness, he put his arm about her. His face was dull to the point of indifference. Don't cry, Miss White. And be good to her, but I know you will be good to her. He picked up his hat, put his coat over his arm, and stretched out his hand to Robert Ferguson with a steady smile. Goodbye, sir. Then the smile dropped and left the amazed and naked face quivering before their eyes. Through the wave of merciful numbness which had given him his hard composure, agony stabbed him. For God's sake, don't be hard on her. She has enough to bear. And blame me. I did it. He turned and fled out of the house, and the two unhappy people who loved Elizabeth looked at each other speechlessly. Chapter 20. Except in his gust of primitive fury when he first knew that he had been robbed, and in that last breaking down in the hall, David knew what had happened to him only, if one may say so, with the outside of his mind. Even while he was talking with comparative calmness to Mr. Ferguson, his thoughts were whirling and veering, in dizzying circles, bewildered rage, pity, fright, revolt, and then back again to half-dazed fury. But each time he tried to realize exactly what had happened, something in him seemed to swerve, like a shying horse. He could not get near enough to the fact, to understand it. In a numb way he must have recognized this, because in those moments by himself in the library he deliberately shut a door upon the blasting truth. Later, of course, he would have to open it and look in upon the ruin of his life. Somewhere back in his thoughts he was aware that this moment of opening the door would come, and come soon. But while he talked to Robert Ferguson, and tried, dully, to comfort Miss White, and even as he went down the steps up which he had bounded not an hour before, he was holding that moment off. His one clear feeling was a desire to be by himself. Then, he promised himself, when he was alone, he would open the door, and face the thing that lay behind it. But as he walked along the street, the door was closed, bolted, locked, and his back was against it. Elizabeth has married Blair, he said to himself, softly. The words seemed to have no meaning. Elizabeth has married Blair, he insisted again, but was only cognizant that the blur of fog around a street lamp showed rainbow lines in a wonderful pattern. They are all at right angles, he said. That's interesting, and looked ahead to see if the next light repeated the phenomenon. Then automatically he took out his watch. 9:30. Elizabeth has married Blair. The train leaves at 10. I had better be going to the depot. Elizabeth has married Blair. And he walked on, looking at the lamps burning in the fog. Then suddenly, as if the closed door showed a crack of light, he decided that he would not go back on the express. An inarticulate impulse pierced him to the quick, the impulse to resist, to fight, to save himself and her. But almost with the rending pang, the door slammed to again and the impulse blurred, like the street lamps. Still, the impetus of it was sufficient to keep him from turning toward the railroad station. Hello, someone said. Harry Knight was standing, grinning, directly in front of him. You needn't run down a friend of your youth, even if you don't condescend to live in Mercer anymore. Oh, hello, David heard himself say. When did you come to town? I'd ask you to lunch with me, but I suppose your lady love would object. Wait till you get to be an old married man like me, then she'll be glad to get rid of you. David knew that he gave the expected laugh, and that he said it was a foggy day, and Philadelphia had a better climate than Mercer. He hasn't heard it yet, he was saying to himself. Yes, dark old hole, I'm going back tonight. Yes, awfully sorry I can't. Goodbye. He'll know by tonight. He did not notice when night seemed to melt into the mist, nor was he conscious that he had begun to walk again, on and on and on. Suddenly he paused before the entrance of a saloon, which bore, above, XXX Pale Ale, in gilt letters on the window, the sign, Landis Hotel. He was aware of overpowering fatigue. Why not go in here and sit down? He would not meet anyone he knew in such a place. Better take a room for an hour or two, he thought. He knew that he must be alone to open that door, but he did not say so. Instead his mind, repeating, parrot-like, Elizabeth has married Blair, made its arrangements for privacy as steadily as a surgeon might make arrangements for a mortal operation. As he entered the hotel, a woman on her hands and knees, slopping a wet cloth over the black and white marble floor of the office, looked up at him, and moved her bucket of dirty water to let him pass. He's got a head on him this morning, she thought knowingly. But the clerk at the desk gave him an uneasy glance. Men with tragic faces and bewildered eyes are not welcomed by hotel clerks. Say, he said, pleasantly enough, as he handed out a key, don't you want to pick me up? You're kind-o white round the gills. David nodded. Where's the bar? He said thickly. He found his way to it, and while he waited for his whiskey he lifted a corkscrew from the counter and looked at it closely. That's something new, isn't it? He said to the man who was rinsing out a glass for him. I never saw a corkscrew. Elizabeth has married Blair, with that hook thing on the side. He took his 2 fingers of whiskey, and followed the bellboy to a room. I don't like that young fella's looks, the clerk told the scrub woman. We don't want any more free reading notices in the papers of this hotel being a roadhouse on the way to heaven. And when the bellboy who had shown the unwelcome guest to his room came back to his bench in the office, he interrogated him, with a grin that was not altogether facetious. Any revolvers lying round up in number 20, or any of those knobby blue bottles? No, said the bellboy, disgustedly, no dimes, neither. David, in the small, unfriendly hotel bedroom that looked out upon squalid backyards and smelled as if its one window had not been opened for a year, was at last alone. Down in the alley, a hand organ was shrilling monotonously, Kafuzalam, Kafuzalam. He looked about him for a minute, then tried to open the window, but the sash stuck. He shook it violently, then shoved it up with such force that a cracked pane of glass clattered out. A gust of raw air came into the stagnant mustiness of the narrow room. After that he sat down and drew a long breath. Then he opened the door. Downstairs the clerk was sharing his uneasiness with the barkeeper. He came in looking like death. Wild-eyed he was. Mrs. Maloney, they will tell you. She came up to me and remarked on it. No, sir, men like that ain't healthy for this hotel. That's so, the barkeeper agreed. Why didn't you tell him you were full up? Well, he seemed the gentleman, the clerk said. I didn't just see my way. The other flung back at him resentfully. Tain't only a poor man that puts his hand in the till, and then hires a room in a hotel. He made a significant gesture and rolled up his eyes. He didn't register, the clerk said. Only wanted the room for a couple of hours. A couple of hours is long enough to, said the barkeeper. Good idea to send a boy up to ask if he rung? I'd have sent him 10 minutes ago, the barkeeper said scornfully. So it was that David, staring in at his ruin, was interrupted more than once that morning. No, I didn't ring. Clear out. And again, no, I'm not waiting for anybody. Shut that door. But the third time he was frantic. Damn it, if you knock on my door again I'll kick you downstairs. Do you understand? And at that the office subsided. They don't do it when they're swearing mad, the barkeeper said. I guess his girl has given him the mitten. You ladies are always making trouble for us, Mrs. Maloney. You drive us to suicide for love of you. Mrs. Maloney simperingly admitted her baleful influence. As for you, he jeered at the clerk, you're fresh, I guess. That little affair in 18 got on your nerves. Well, if you'd found him as I did, I guess it would got on your nerves, the clerk said, affrontedly. He added under his breath that they could kill themselves all over the house, and he wouldn't lift a finger to stop them. You don't get no thanks, he told himself gloomily. But after that, number 20 was not disturbed. At first, when David opened his closed door and looked in, there had been the shock again. He was stunned with incredulous astonishment. Then his mind cleared. With the clearing came once more that organic anger of the robbed man, an anger that has in it the uncontrollable impulse to regain his property. It could not be this thing that had happened. It should not be. He would see her, he would take her. As for him, David's sinewy fingers closed as talons might close into the living flesh of a man's neck. He knew the lust of murder, and he exulted in it. Yet even as he exulted, the baseness of what Blair had done was so astounding, that, sitting there in the dreary room, his hands clenched in his pockets, his legs stretched out in front of him, David Ritchie actually felt a sort of impersonal amazement that had nothing to do with anger. For one instant the unbelievableness of Blair's dishonor threw him back into that clamoring confusion from which he had escaped since he opened the door. Blair must have been in love with her. Had Elizabeth suspected it? She certainly had never hinted it to him. Why not? Some girlish delicacy? But Blair, a dishonorable man? In the confounding turmoil of this uprooting of old admirations, he was conscious of the hand organ down in the alley, pounding out its imbecile refrain. He even found himself repeating the meaningless words. In ancient days there lived a Turk, a horrid beast within the east. Oh, Kafusalam, Kafusalam. His mind righted itself. He came back to facts, and to the simple incisive question, what must he do? It was not until the afternoon that, by one tortuous and torturing line of reasoning after another, he came to know that, as her uncle had said, for the present he could do nothing. Nothing. At first, David had laughed savagely. He would turn the world upside down before he would leave her in her misery. For that she was in misery he never doubted, nor did he stop to ask himself whether she had repented her madness, he only groaned. He saw, or thought he saw, the whole thing. There was not one doubt, not one poisonous suspicion of Elizabeth herself. That she was disloyal to him never entered his head. To David she was only in a terrible trap, from which, at any cost, she must be rescued. That her own mad temper had brought her to such a pass was neither here nor there. It had nothing to do with the matter in hand, namely her rescue, and then the killing of the man who had trapped her. It came into David's head, like a lamp moving toward him through a mist, that perhaps she had written to him. He had not really grasped the idea when Robert Ferguson suggested it, but now he was suddenly certain that a letter must be awaiting him in Philadelphia. Perhaps in it she called on him to come and help her? The thought was like a whip. He forgot his desire to kill Blair. He leaped to his feet, fumbling in his pocket for a timetable, then realized that there was no train across the mountains until night. Should he telegraph his mother to open any letter from Elizabeth, and wire him where she was? No. Even in the whirl of his perplexity, he knew he could not let any other eyes than his own see what, in her abasement, Elizabeth must have written. He began to pace frantically up and down, then stood and looked out of the window, beating his mind back to calmness, for he must be calm. He must think what could be done. He would get the letter as soon as he reached home. Until he got it and learned where she was, the only thing to do was to decide how she should be saved. And so it was that, not allowing himself to deep down into that elemental rage of the wronged man, not even daring to think of his own incredible blunder which had kindled her crazy anger, still less venturing to let his thought rest on the suffering that had come to her, he kept his mind steadily on that one imperative question: what was to be done? At first the situation seemed almost simple: she must leave Blair instantly. Today, he said to himself, striking the rickety table before him with his fist, today. Next, the marriage must be annulled. That was all. Annulled? These were the premises from which he started. All that long, dark morning, well into the afternoon, he followed blind alleys of thought, ending always in the same impasse. There was nothing he could do. He did not even know where she was, until the letter in Philadelphia should tell him. At that thought he looked at his watch again. Oh, how many endless hours before he could go and get that letter. And after all, she was Blair Maitland's wife. Suppose she did leave him, would the swine give her freedom? Not without long, involved processes of law. He knew his man well enough to know that. Yes, there would have to be dreadful publicity, heartbreaking humiliation for his poor, mad darling. She would have to face those things. Oh, if he only knew where she was, so that he could go that moment and help her to take that first step of flight. She must go at once to his mother. Yes, his mother would shelter her from the beast. If he could only get word to her, to go, instantly, to his mother. But he did not know where she was. He cursed himself for not having taken the 10 o'clock express. He could have been at home that night, had her letter, and started out again to go to her. As it was, nothing could be done until tomorrow morning. Then he would know what to do, because then he would know where she was. But meantime, there is no doubt that when the frantic man realized his befogging ignorance, and found himself involved in this dreadful delay, the hotel clerk's apprehensions were, at least for wild moments, justified. But only for moments. Elizabeth was to be rescued. David could not consider escape from his own misery until that task had been accomplished. Yet consider, his girl, his woman, another man's, and he helpless. And suppose he did rescue her, suppose he did drag her from the arms of the thief who had been his friend, could it ever be the same? Never, never, never. His Elizabeth was dead. The woman whom he meant to have yet, somehow, sometime, somewhere, the woman whom Blair Maitland had filched from him, was not his Elizabeth. The rose, trampled in the mire, may be lifted, it may be revived, it may be fragrant, but it has known the mire. There were, in the early darkening afternoon, crazy moments for David Ritchie. Moments of murderous hate of Blair, moments of unbearable consciousness of his own responsibility, moments of almost repulsion for the tragic, marred creature he loved, and at this last appalling revelation to himself of his own possibilities, moments of absolute despair. And when one of those despairing moments came, he put his head down on the table, on his folded arms, and cried for his mother. He cried hard, like a child, Materna. And so it was that he arose and went to his mother. Chapter 21. When, after his interview with David, Robert Ferguson went into Mrs. Maitland's office at the works, he looked older by 20 years than when he had left it the night before. Sarah Maitland, sitting at her desk, heard his step, and wheeled round to greet him. "Better shut that door," she said briefly, and he gave the door in the glass partition a shove with his foot. Then they looked at each other. "Well," she said, and stretched out her hand. "We're in the same box. I guess we'd better shake hands." She grinned with pain, but she forced her grunt of a laugh. "What's your story?" "Mine is only his explanation to Nanny." "Mine isn't even that. She merely wrote me she had married him, that was all. Miss White told me what he wrote to Nanny." "What do you know about it?" "That's all I know," she said, and gave him Blair's note. He read it, and handed it back in silence. "Well, what are you going to do?" she asked. "Do? There's nothing to do. I'm done with her. He's my son," Sarah Maitland said. "I have got to do something." "But there's nothing to be done," he pointed out. It was not like this ruthless woman to waste time crying over spilt milk. They are both of age, and they are married, that's all there is to it. I went into the mayor's office and found the registry. The marriage is all right so far as that goes. As for David, men don't go out with a gun or a horsewhip in these fine times. He won't do anything. For that matter, he is well rid of her. I told him so. I might have added that the best thing a jilted man can do is to go down on his knees and thank God that he's been jilted. I know what I'm talking about. As for your son, he stopped. Yes, she said, my son? And even in his fury, Robert Ferguson felt a pang at the sight of her torn and ravaged face that quivered so that he turned his eyes away out of sheer decency. I must do something for my son. And I think I know what it will be. She bit her forefinger, frowning with thought. I think I know. I have not done right by Blair. No, you haven't, he said dryly. Have you just discovered that? But I don't see what your Uriah God Almighty can do now. They're married. Oh, I can't do anything about this marriage, she said, with a gesture of indifference, but that's not the important thing. Not important? What do you mean? I mean that the important thing is to know what made Blair behave in this way, and then cure him. Cure him. There's no cure for rottenness. He was so beside himself with pain that he forgot that she was a woman, and Blair's mother. I blame myself for Blair's conduct, she said. Oh, Elizabeth is as bad as he is? But he waited for her contradiction. It did not come, probably worse. Involuntarily he raised a protesting hand. But I mean to forgive her, said Sarah Maitland, with cold determination. Forgive Elizabeth? He said, angrily, and his anger was the very small end of the wedge of his own forgiveness. Forgive her? It strikes me the boot is on the other leg, Mrs. Maitland. Oh, well, she said, what difference does it make? I guess it's a case of the pot in the kettle. I'm not blaming your girl over much, although a bad woman is always worse than a bad man. In this case, Elizabeth acted from hate, and Blair from love. The result is the same, of course, but one motive is worse than the other. But never mind that Blair has got her, and he will be faithful to her, for a while, anyhow. And Elizabeth will get used to him, that's nature, and nature is bigger than a girl's first fancy. So if David doesn't interfere, you think he won't? You don't know human nature, friend Ferguson. David isn't a saint, at least I hope he isn't. I don't care much about 27-year-old male saints. David may not be able to interfere, but he'll try to, somehow. You wait. As for Blair, as I say, if David doesn't put his finger in the pie, Blair isn't hopeless. I'm glad you think so. I do think so. Blair is young yet, and if she costs him something, he may value her, and I think I can manage to make her cost him something. A man doesn't value what comes cheap, and all his life everything has come cheap to Blair. I don't see what you're driving at. Just this, she explained. Blair has had everything he wanted. Oh, yes, it's my fault. She struck an impatient fist upon the arm of her chair. I told you it was my fault. Don't take precious time to eye over that. It is all my fault. There. Will that satisfy you? I've given him everything. So he thought he could have everything. He doesn't know the meaning of no, he has got to learn. I shall teach him. I have thought it all out. I'm going to make a man of him. How? Said Robert Ferguson. I haven't got the details clear in my mind yet, but this is the gist of it. No money but what he earns. No money? After this, it will be root, hog, or die. But Blair can't root, her superintendent said, fair in spite of himself. And at that her face lighted with a sort of awful purpose. Then he must die, Ferguson. Don't you see, he has begun to die already? Again her face quivered. Look at this business of taking David's wife. Oh, I know, they weren't married yet, but the principle is the same. What do you call that but dying? Look at his whole life. What has he done? Received. Given nothing. Ferguson, you can't fool God. You've got to give something. A privilege means an obligation, the obligation of sweat. Sweat of your body or your brains. Blair has never sweated. He's always had something for nothing. That is the one immorality that damns. It has damned Blair. Of course, I ought to have realized it before, but I suppose I was too busy. Yes, I tell you, if Blair had had to work for what he's got, as you and I have worked for what we've got, he wouldn't be where he is today. You know that. He'd have had something else to think of than satisfying his eyes or his stomach or his lust. He'd have been decent. He might have been, Robert Ferguson said drearily, but I doubt it. Anyway, you can't, by making him earn or go without, or anything else, give David's girl back to him. No, she said heavily, and for a moment her passion of hope flagged. No, I can't do that. But I shall try to make it up to David in some way, of course. Where is he? She broke off. He told her briefly of David's arrival and departure. He's gone back to his mother, he ended. She'll comfort him. Then, with a bark of anger, he added, Mrs. Ritchie was always saying that Elizabeth would turn out well. I wonder what she will say now? I knew better. Her mother, my brother Arthur's wife, was no good. Yet I let Mrs. Ritchie bamboozle me into building on her. I always said life shouldn't play the same trick on me twice, but it has done it. It has done it. My heart was set on Elizabeth. Yes, Mrs. Maitland, I've been fooled again, but so have you. Nothing of the kind. I never was fooled before, Sarah Maitland said, and I shan't be again. I am going to make a man of my son. As for your girl, forgive her, Ferguson. Don't be a fool. You take it out of yourself when you refuse forgiveness. I'll never forgive her, said Robert Ferguson. She's hurt the woman I have a regard for. She's made David's mother suffer. I'm done with her. Chapter 22. When, on drunken and then on leaden feet, there came to Elizabeth the ruthless tomorrow of her act, her first clear thought was to kill herself. After the marriage in the mayor's office, where they paused long enough to write the 2 notes that were received the next day, Blair had fled with her up into the mountains to a little hotel, where they would not, he felt certain, encounter any acquaintances. Elizabeth neither assented nor objected. From the moment she had struck her hand into his, there in the tawdry saloon of the toll house, and cried out, come. She let him do as he chose. So he had carried her away to the city hall, where, like any other unclassed or unchurched lovers, they were married by a hurried city official. She had had one more crisis of rage, when in the mayor's office, as she stood at a high-wall desk and wrote with an ink-encrusted pen that brief note to her uncle, she said to herself that, as to David Ritchie, he could hear the news from her uncle or never hear it. She didn't care which. Then for an instant her eyes glittered again, but except for that one moment, she seemed stunned, mind and body. To Blair, her silent acquiescences had been signs that he had won something more than her consent to revenge herself upon David, and he wanted more. In all his life he had never deeply cared for anybody but himself, but now, under the terrible selfishness of his act, under the primitive instinct that he called love, there was trembling in the depths of his nature, love. It had been born only a little while ago, this new, naked baby of love. It had had no power and no knowledge. Unaided by that silent God of his, it had not been strong enough to save him from himself, or save Elizabeth from him. But he did love her, in spite of his treason to her soul, for he was tender with her, and almost humble, yet his purpose was inflexible. It seemed to him it must find response in her. Such purpose might strike fire from the most unbending steel. Why not from this yielding, silent thing, Elizabeth's heart? But numb and flaccid, perfectly apathetic, stunned by that paroxysm of fury, she no more responded to him than down would have responded to the blow of flint. It was their second day in the mountains. Blair, going downstairs very early in the morning, stopped in the office of the hotel to write a brief but intensely polite note to his mother, telling her of his marriage. Nanny will have broken it to her, poor, dear old Nanny. He said to himself, pounding a stamp down on the envelope, but of course it's proper to announce it myself. Then he dropped the announcement into the post bag, and went out for a tramp in the woods. It was a still, furtive morning of low clouds, with an expectancy of snow in the air. But it was not cold, and when, leaving the road and pushing aside the frosted ferns and underbrush, he found himself in the silence of the woods, he sat down on a fallen tree trunk to think. The moment had come when the only God he knew would no longer be denied. I might as well face it, he said, and slowly lit a cigar. But instead of facing it, he began to watch the first sparse and fitful beginnings of snow, hesitant flakes that sauntered down to rest for a crystal moment on his coat sleeve. Suddenly he caught his thoughts together with a jerk. I've got to think it out, he said. Curiously enough, when he said this his thought did not turn with any especial distinctness to David Ritchie. Instead, in the next hour of reasonings and excuses, there was always, back in his mind, one face, scornful, contemptuous even, a face he had known only as gentle, and sometimes tender, the face of David's mother. Once he swore at himself, to drive that face out of his mind. What a fool I am. Elizabeth had broken her engagement with him. I had the right to speak before the thing was smoothed over again. Anybody would say so, even Mrs. Ritchie, if she could really understand how things were. But of course she will only see his side. All his excuses for his conduct were in relation to David Ritchie. He did not think of Elizabeth. He honestly did not know that he had wronged her. He loved her so crazily that he could not realize his cruelty. It was snowing steadily now. He could hear the faint patter of small, hard flakes on the dry oak leaves over his head. Suddenly some bleached and withered ferns in front of him rustled, and he saw wise, bright eyes looking at him. "I wish I had some nuts for you, Bunny," he said, and the bright eyes vanished with a furry whirl through the ferns. He picked up the empty half of a hickory nut, and turning it over in his fingers, looked at the white grooves left by small sharp teeth. "You little beggars must get pretty hungry in the winter, Bunny," he said. "I'll bring a bag of nuts out here for you someday." But while he was talking to the squirrel, he was wrestling with his God. It was characteristic of him that never once in that struggle to justify himself did he use the excuse of Elizabeth's consent. His code, which had allowed him to injure a woman, would not permit him to blame her, even if she deserved it. Instead, over and over he heaped up his own poor defense. If I had waited, he might have patched it up with her. Over and over the defense crumbled before his eyes. It was contemptible not to give him the chance to patch it up. Then would come his angry retort, "That's nonsense. Besides, it is better, infinitely better, for her to marry me than a poor man like him. I can give her everything, and love her. God, how I love her. Apart from any selfish consideration, it is 1,000 times better for her." For an instant his marrying her seemed actually chivalrous, and at that his God laughed. Blair reddened sharply. To recognize his hypocrisy was the touch on the hollow of the thigh, and the hollow of the thigh was out of joint. He pitched the nut away with a vicious fling, and knew, inarticulately, that there was no use lying to himself any longer. With blank eyes he watched the snow piling up on a withered stalk of goldenrod. "I wish it hadn't happened in just the way it did," he conceded. His God was beginning to prevail. "But if I had waited, I might have lost her." Then a thought stabbed him. Suppose that he should lose her anyhow? Suppose that when she came to herself, the phrase was a confession. Suppose she should want to leave him? It was an intolerable idea. Well, she can't, he told himself, grimly, she can't now. His face was dusky with shame, yet when he said that, his lip loosened in a furtively exultant smile. Blair would have been less, or more, than a man if, at that moment, in spite of his shame, he had not exulted. "She's my wife," he said, through those shamed and smiling lips. Then his eyes narrowed. "And she doesn't care a damn for me." So it was that as he sat there in the snow, watching the puff of white deepen on the stalk of goldenrod, his God prevailed yet a little more, for, so far as Elizabeth was concerned, he did not try to fool himself. She doesn't care a damn. But when he said that, he saw the task of his life before him to make her care. It was like the touch of a spur. He leaped to his feet, and flung up his arms in a sort of challenge. Yes, he had done the thing a man can't do. Yes, he ought not to have taken advantage of her anger. Yes, his honor was smirched. Grant it all. Grant it all. "I was mad," he said, stung by this intolerable self-knowledge. "I was a cur. I ought to have waited, I know it. I admit it. But what's the use of talking about it now? It's done, and by God, she shall love me yet." So it was that his God blessed him, as the best that is in us always blesses us when it conquers us. The blessing was the revelation of his own dishonor. It is a divine moment, this of the consciousness of having been faithless to one's own ideals. And Blair Maitland, a false friend, a selfish and cruel lover, was not entirely contemptible, for his eyes, beautiful and evasive, confessed the shock of a heavenly vision. As he walked home, he laid his plans very carefully. He must show her the most delicate consideration. He must avoid every possible annoyance. He must do this, he must not do that. "And I'll buy her a pearl necklace," he told himself, too absorbed in the gravity of the situation to see in such an impulse the assertion that he was indeed his mother's son. But the foundation of all his plans for making Elizabeth content was the determination not to admit for a single instant, to anybody but himself, that he had done anything to be ashamed of. Which showed that his God was not yet God. When he got back to the hotel, he found that Elizabeth had not left her room, and rushing upstairs 2 steps at a time, he knocked at her door. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her lips parted, her eyes staring blindly out of the window at the snow. The flakes were so thick now that the meadow on the other side of the road and the mountain beyond were blurred and almost blotted out. There was a grey pallor on her face as if the shadow of the storm had fallen on it. Instantly Blair knew that she had come to herself. As he stood looking at her, something tightened in his throat. He broke out into the very last thing he had meant to say. "Elizabeth, forgive me? I ought to die, you know," she said, without turning her eyes from the window and the falling snow. He came and knelt down beside her and kissed her hand. "Elizabeth, dearest, when I love you so?" He kissed her shoulder. She shivered. "My darling," he said, passionately. She looked at him dully. "I wish you would go away. Elizabeth, let me tell you how I love you." "Love me?" she said. "Me? Elizabeth," he protested. "You are an angel, and I love you. No man ever loved a woman as I love you." In her abasement she never thought of reproaching him, of saying, "If you loved me, why did you betray me?" She had not gone as far as that yet. Her fall had been so tremendous that if she had any feeling about him, it was nothing more than the consciousness that he too had gone over the precipice. "Please go away," she said. "Dearest, listen, you are my wife. If I hurried you too much, you will forgive me because I loved you so?" I didn't dare to wait, for fear. He stumbled on the confession which his God had wrung from him, but which must not be made to her. Elizabeth's heavy eyes were suddenly keen. "Fear of what? Oh, don't look at me that way. I love you so that it kills me to have you angry at me." "I am not angry with you," she said, faintly surprised. "Why should I be angry with you?" "Only, you see, Blair, I can't live. I simply can't live." "You have got to live, or I'll die," he said. "I love you. I tell you I love you." His outstretched, trembling hands entreated hers, but she would not yield them to his touch. Her shrinking movement away from him, her hands gripped together at her throat, filled him with absolute terror. "Elizabeth, don't," she glanced at him with stony eyes. Blair was suffering. Why should he suffer? But his suffering did not interest her. "Please go away," she said, heavily. He went. He dared not stay. He left her, going miserably downstairs to make a pretense of eating some breakfast. But all the while he was arranging entreaties and arguments in his own mind. He went to the door of their room a dozen times that morning, but it was locked. No, she did not want any breakfast. Wouldn't she come out and walk? No, no, no. Please let her alone. And then in the afternoon, "Elizabeth, I must come in. You must have some food." She let him enter, but she was indifferent alike to the food and to the fact that by this time there was, of course, a giggling consciousness in the hotel that the bride and groom had had a rumpus. "A nice beginning for a honeymoon," said the chambermaid, locking that pretty young man out of her room, "and me with my work to do in there. Well, I'm sorry for him. I bet you she's a case." Blair, too, was indifferent to anything ridiculous in his position. The moment was too critical for such self-consciousness. When at last he took a little tray of food to his wife, and knelt beside her, begging her to eat, he was appalled at the ruin in her face. She drank some tea to please him. Then she said, pitifully, "What shall we do, Blair?" That she should say, "we," showed that these hours which had ploughed her face had also sowed some seed of unselfishness in her broken soul. "Darling," he said, tenderly, "have you forgiven me?" At this she meditated for a minute, staring with big, anguished eyes straight ahead of her at nothing. "I think I have, Blair. I have tried to. Of course I know I was more wicked than you. It was more my doing than yours. Yes. I ought to ask you if you would forgive me." "Elizabeth, forgive you? When you made me so happy? Am I to forgive you for making me happy?" "Blair," she said, she put the palms of her hands together, like a child. "Blair, please let me go." She looked at him with speechless entreaty. The old dominant Elizabeth was gone. Here was nothing but the weak thing, the scared thing, pleading, crouching, begging for mercy. "Please, Blair, please." But the very tragedy of such humbleness was that it made an appeal to passion rather than to mercy. It made him love her more, not pity her more. I can't let you go, Elizabeth, he said, hoarsely. I can't, I love you, I will never let you go. I will die before I will let you go. With that cry of complete egotism from him, the storm which her egotism had let loose upon their little world broke over her own head. As the sense of the hopelessness of her position and the futility of her struggle dawned upon her, she grew frightened to the point of violence. She was outrageous in what she said to him, beating against the walls of this prison house of marriage which she herself had reared about them, and crying wildly for freedom. Yet strangely enough, her fury was never the fury of temper, it was the fury of fear. In her voice there was a new note, a note of entreaty. She demanded, but not with the old invincible determination of the free Elizabeth. She was now only the woman pleading with the man, the wife, begging the husband. Through it all, her jailer, insulted, commanded, threatened, never lost a gentleness that had sprung up in him side by side with love. It was, of course, the gentleness of power, although he did not realize that, for he was abjectly frightened. He never stopped to reassure himself by remembering that, after all, rave as she might, she was his. He was incredibly soft with her, up to a certain point. I will never let you go. If his God spoke, the whisper was drowned in that gale of selfishness. Elizabeth, now, was the flint, striking that she might kindle in Blair some fire of anger which would burn up the whole edifice of her despair. But he opposed to her fiercest blows of terror and entreaty nothing but this softness of frightened love and unconscious power. He cowered at the thought of losing her. He entreated her pity, her mercy, he wept before her. The whole scene in that room in the inn, with the silent whirl of snow outside the windows, was one of dreadful abasement and brutality on both sides. I am a bad woman. I will not stay with you. I will kill myself first. I am going away. I am going away tonight. Then you will kill me. Elizabeth, think how I love you, think. And he wouldn't want you, since you threw him over. You couldn't go back to him. Go back to David, now? How can you say such a thing? I am dead, so far as he is concerned. Oh, why am I not dead? Why do I go on living? I will kill myself rather than stay with you. It seemed to Elizabeth that she had forgotten David. She had forgotten that she had meant to write him a terrible letter. She had forgotten everything but the blasting realization of what had happened to her. Do not dare to speak his name, she said, frantically. I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it. I am dead to him. He despises me, as I despise myself. Blair, I can't live. I can't go on. In the end he conquered. There were 2 days and nights of struggle, and then she yielded. Blair's reiterated appeal was to her sense of justice. Curiously, but most characteristically, through all the clamor of her despair at this incredible thing that she had done, justice was the one word which penetrated to her consciousness. Was it fair, she debated, numbly, in one of their long, aching silences, was it just, that because she had ruined herself, she should ruin him? She had locked herself in her room, and was sitting with her head on her arms that were stretched before her on a little table. Blair had gone out for one of his long, wretched walks through the snow. Sometimes he took the landlord's dog along for company, and on this particular morning, a morning of brilliant sunshine and cold, insolent wind, he had stopped to buy a bag of nuts for the hungry squirrels in the woods. As he walked he was planning how he could make his misery touch Elizabeth's heart. He was all unconscious that her misery had not yet touched his heart. But Elizabeth, locked in her room, was beginning to think of his misery. Dully at first, then with dreary concentration, she went over in her mind his arguments and pleadings. He was satisfied to love her even if she didn't love him. He had known what stakes he played for, and he was willing to abide by them. She ought to do the same. She had done this thing, she had married him. Was it fair, now, to destroy him, soul and body, just because she had acted on a moment's impulse? In a crisis of terror, his primitive instinct of self-preservation had swept away the acquired instinct of chivalry, and like a brutal boy, he had reminded her that she was to blame as well as he. You did it, too, he told her. Sullenly, she remembered that he had said he had not fully understood that it was only impulse on her part. I thought you cared for me a little, or else you wouldn't have married me. In the panic of the moment he really had not known that he lied, and in her absorption in her own misery she did not contradict him. She ought, he said, to make the best of the situation, or else he would kill himself. Do you want me to kill myself? He had threatened, if she would make the best of it, he would help her. He would do whatever she wished, he would be her friend, her servant, until she should come to love him. I shall never love you, she told him. I will always love you. But I will not make you unhappy. Let me be your servant, that's all I ask. I love David. I will always love him. He had been silent at that, then broke again into a cry for mercy. I don't care if you do love him. Don't destroy me, Elizabeth. He had still one other weapon, they were married. There was no getting round that. The thing was done, except by time and the outrageous scandal of publicity, it could not be undone. But this weapon he had not used, knowing perfectly well that the idea of public shame would be, just then, a matter of indifference to Elizabeth, perhaps even a satisfaction to her, as the sting of the penitential whip is a satisfaction to the sinner. All he said was summed up in 3 words, don't destroy me. There was no reply. She had fallen into a silence which frightened him more than her words. It was then that he went out for that walk on the creaking snow, in the sunshine and fierce wind, taking the bag of nuts along for the squirrels. Elizabeth, alone, her head on her arms on the table, went over and over his threats and entreaties, until it seemed as if her very mind was so. After a while, for sheer weariness, she left the tangle of motives and facts and obligations, and began to think of David. It was then that she moaned a little under her breath. Twice she had tried to write to him to tell him what had happened. But each time she cringed away from her pen and paper. After all, what could she write? The fact said all there was to say, and he knew the fact by this time.
When she said that, her mind, drawn by some horrible curiosity, would begin to speculate as to how he had heard the fact.
Who told him? What did he say? How did he? And here she would groan aloud in an effort not to know how he took it. To save herself from this speculation which seemed to dig into a grave, and touch and handle the decaying body of love, she would plan what she should say to him when, after a while, tomorrow, perhaps, she should be able to take up her pen. David, I was out of my head. Think of me as if I were dead. David, I don't want you to forgive me. I want you to hate me as I hate myself. David, I was not in my right mind, forgive me. I love you just the same. But it is as if I were dead. Again and again she had thought out long, crying, frightened letters to him, but she had not written them. And now she was beginning to feel, vaguely, that she would never write them. What is the use? I am dead. The idea of calling upon him to come and save her, never occurred to her. I am dead, she said, as she sat there, her face hidden in her arms. There is nothing to be done. After a while she stopped thinking of David and the letter she had not been able to write. It seemed as if, when she tried to make it clear to herself why she did not write to him, something stopped in her mind, a cog did not catch, the thought eluded her. When this happened, as it had happened again and again in these last days, she would fall to thinking, with vague amazement, that this irremediable catastrophe was out of all proportion to its cause. It was monstrous that a crazy minute should ruin a whole life, 2 whole lives, hers and David's. It was as if a pebble should deflect a river from its course, and make it turn and overflow a landscape. It was incredible that so temporary a thing as an outbreak of temper should have eternal consequences. She gasped, with her face buried in her arms, at the realization, which comes to most of us poor human creatures sooner or later, that sins may be forgiven, but their results remain. As for sin, but surely that meaningless madness was not sin? It was insanity, she said, shivering at the memory of that hour in the toll house, that little mad hour, that brought eternity with it. She had had other crazy hours, with no such weight of consequence. Her mind went back over her engagement, her love, her happiness, and her tempers. Well, nothing had come of them. David always understood. And still further back, her careless, fiery girlhood, when the knowledge of her mother's recreancy, undermining her sense of responsibility by the condoning suggestion of heredity, had made her quick to excuse her lack of self-control. Her girlhood had been full of those outbreaks of passion, which she couldn't help. They were all meaningless, and all harmless, too. At any rate they were all without results of pain to her. Suddenly it seemed to her, as she looked across the roaring gulf that separated her from the past, that all her life had been just a sunny slope down to the edge of the gulf. All those harmless tempers which had had no results, had pushed her to this result. Her poor, bright, shamed head lay so long and so still on her folded arms that one looking in upon her might have thought her dead. Perhaps, In a way, Elizabeth did die then, when her heart seemed to break with the knowledge that it is impossible to escape from yesterday. "Oh," she said, brokenly, "why didn't somebody tell me? Why didn't they stop me?" But she did not dwell upon the responsibility of other people. She forgot the easy excuse of heredity. This new knowledge brought with it a vision of her own responsibility that filled her appalled mind to the exclusion of everything else. It is not the pebble that turns the current, it is the easy slope that invites it. All her life Elizabeth had been inviting this moment, and the moment, when it came, was her day of judgment. What she had thought of as an incredible injustice of fate in letting a mad instant turn the scales for a whole life, was merely an inevitable result of all that had preceded it. When this fierce and saving knowledge came to her, she thought of Blair. "I have spoiled my own life and David's life. I needn't spoil Blair's. He said if I left him, it would destroy him. Perhaps if I stay, it will be my punishment. I can never be punished enough." When Blair came home, she was standing with her forehead against the window, her dry eyes watching the dazzling white world. Coming up behind her, he took her hand and kissed it humbly. She turned and looked at him with somber eyes. "Poor Blair," she said. And Blair, under his breath, said, "Thank God." Chapter 23. The coming back to Mercer some 6 weeks later was to Blair a miserable and skulking experience. To Elizabeth it was almost a matter of indifference. There is a shame which goes too deep for embarrassment. The night they arrived at the river house, Nanny and Miss White were waiting for them, tearful and disapproving, of course, but distinctly excited and romantic. After all, Elizabeth was a bride. And Cherry Pie and Nanny couldn't help being fluttered. Blair listened with open amusement to their half-scared gossip of what people thought, and what the newspapers had said, and how, very displeased, his mother had been, but Elizabeth hardly heard them. At the end of the call, while Blair was bidding Nanny tell his mother he was coming to see her in the morning, Miss White, kissing her lamb good night, tried to whisper something in her ear. "He said to tell you." No, I can't hear it. I can't bear it yet." Elizabeth broke in. She put her hands over her eyes, shivering so that Cherry Pie forgot David and his message, and even her child's bad behavior. "Elizabeth, you've taken cold?" Elizabeth drew away, smiling faintly. "No, not at all. I'm tired. Please don't stay." And with the message still unspoken, Miss White and Nanny went off together, as fluttering and frightened as when they came. The newspaper excitement which had followed the announcement of the elopement of Sarah Maitland's son had subsided, so there was only a brief notice the morning after their arrival in town, to the effect that the bride and groom had returned to their native city for a short stay before sailing for Europe. Still, even though the papers were inclined to let them alone, it would be pleasanter, Blair told his wife, to go abroad. "Well," she said, dully. Elizabeth was always dull now. She had lifted herself up to the altar, but there was no exaltation of sacrifice, possibly because she considered her sacrifice a punishment for her sin, but also because she was still physically and morally stunned. "Of course there is nobody in Mercer for whose opinion I care a copper," Blair said. They were sitting in their parlor at the hotel, Elizabeth staring out of the window at the river, Blair leaning forward in his chair, touching once in a while, with timid fingers, a fold of her skirt that brushed his knee. "Of course I don't care for a lot of gossiping old hens, but it will be pleasanter for you not to be meeting people, perhaps?" he said gently. There was only one person whom he himself shrank from meeting, his mother. And this shrinking was not because of the peculiar shame which the thought of Mrs. Ritchie had awakened in him that morning in the woods, when the vision of her delicate scorn had been so unbearable. His feeling about his mother was sheer disgust at the prospect of an interview which was sure to be aesthetically distressing. While he was still absent on what the papers called his wedding tour, Nanny had written to him warning him what he might expect from Mrs. Maitland. "Mamma is terribly displeased, I am afraid, though she hasn't said a word since the night I told her. Then she said very severe things, and oh, Blair, dear, why did you do it the way you did?" I think Elizabeth was perfectly, the unfinished sentence was scratched out. "You must be nice to Mamma when you come home," she ended. "She'll kick," Blair said, sighing. "She'll roll like a puddler." In his own mind, he added that, after all, no amount of kicking would alter the fact. And again the little exultant smile came about his lips. As for being nice, Nanny might as well talk about being nice to a circular saw, he said, gaily. His efforts to be gay, to amuse or interest Elizabeth, were almost pathetic in their intensity. Well, the sooner I'll go, the sooner I'll get it over, he said, and reached for his hat. Elizabeth was silent. You might wish me luck, he said. She did not answer, and he sighed and left her. As he loitered down to Shantytown, lying in the muddy drizzle of a midwinter thaw, he planned how soon he could get away from the detestable place. Everything is so perfectly hideous, he said to himself, no wonder she is low-spirited. When I get her over in Europe she'll forget Mercer and everything disagreeable. His mind shied away from even the name of the man he had robbed. At his mother's house, he had a hurried word with Nanny in the parlor. Is she upset still? She mustn't blame Elizabeth, it was all my doing. I sort of swept Elizabeth off her feet, you know. Well, it's another case of getting your tooth pulled quickly. Here goes. When he opened the dining room door, his mother called to him from her bedroom. Come in here, she said, and there was something in her voice that made him brace himself. I'm in for it, he said, under his breath. For years Sarah Maitland's son had not seen her room. The sight of it now was a curious shock that seemed to push him back into his youth, and into that old embarrassment which he had always felt in her presence. The room was as it had been then, very bare and almost squalid. There was no carpet on the floor, and no hint of feminine comfort in a lounge or even a soft chair. That morning the inside shutters on the lower half of the uncurtained windows were still closed, and the upper light, striking cold and bleak across the dingy ceiling, glimmered on the glass doors of the bookcases behind which, in his childhood, had lurked such mysterious terrors. The narrow iron bed had not yet been made up, and the bedclothes were in confusion on the back of a chair. The painted pine bureau was thick with dust. On it was the still unopened cologne bottle, its kid cover cracked and yellow under its faded ribbons, and 3 small photographs. Blair, a baby in a white dress, a little boy with long trousers and a visored cap, a big boy of 12 with a wooden gun. They were brown with time, and the figures were almost undistinguishable, but Blair recognized them, and again his armor of courage was penetrated. Well, mother, he said, with great directness and with at least an effort at heartiness, I am afraid you are rather disgusted with me. Are you? She said. She was sitting sidewise on a wooden chair, what is called a kitchen chair. She had rested her arm along its back, and as Blair entered, her large, beautiful hand, drooping limply from its wrist, closed slowly into an iron fist. No, I won't sit down, thank you, he said, and stood, lounging a little, with an elbow on the mantelpiece. Yes, I was afraid you would be displeased, he went on, good-humoredly, but I hope you won't mind so much when I tell you about it. I couldn't really go into it in my letter. By the way, I hope my absence hasn't inconvenienced you in the office? Well, not seriously, she said dryly. And he felt the color rise in his face. That he was frightfully ill at ease was obvious in the elaborate carelessness with which he began to inquire about the works. But her only answer to his meaningless questions was silence. Blair was conscious that he was breathing quickly, and that made him angry. Why am I such an ass? He asked himself. Then said, with studied lightness, that he was afraid he would have to absent himself from business for still a little longer, as he was going abroad. Fortunately, here the old sarcastic politeness broke into his really serious purpose to be respectful. Fortunately, he was so unimportant that his absence didn't really matter. You are the works, you know, mother. You are certainly unimportant, she agreed. He noticed she had not taken up her knitting, though a ball of pink worsted and a half-finished baby sock lay on the bureau near her. This unwonted quiet of her hands, together with the extraordinary solemnity of her face, gave him a sense of uneasy astonishment. He would almost have welcomed one of those brutal outbursts which set his teeth on edge by their very ugliness. He did not know how to treat this new dignity. I would like to tell you just what happened, he began, with a seriousness that matched her own. Elizabeth had made up her mind not to marry David Ritchie. They had had some falling out, I believe. I never asked what. Of course that wasn't my business. Well, I had been in love with her for months, but I didn't suppose I had a ghost of a chance. Of course I wouldn't have dreamed of trying to take her from him. But when she broke with him, why, I felt that I had a right, you know. His mother was silent, but she struck the back of her chair softly with her closed fist. Her eyebrow began to lift ominously. Well, I thought, that the easiest way all round was to get married at once. Not discuss it, with people, but just, well, in point of fact, I persuaded her to run off with me. He tried to laugh, but his mother's face was rigid. She was looking at him closely, but she said nothing. By this time her continued silence had made him so nervous that he went through his explanation again from beginning to end. Still she did not speak. "You see, mother," he said, reddening with the discomfort of the moment, "you see it was best to do it quickly. Elizabeth's engagement being broken, there was no reason to wait. But I do regret that I could not have told you first. I fear you felt annoyed." Annoyed? For a moment she smiled. "Well, I should hardly call it annoyed." Suddenly she made a gesture with her hand, as if to say, "Stop all this nonsense. Blair," she said, "I'm not going to go into this business of your marriage at all. It's done." Blair drew a breath of astonished relief. "You've not only done a wicked thing, which is bad, you've done a fool thing, which is worse. I have some sort of patience with a knave, but a fool annoys me, as you express it. You've married a girl who loves another man. You may or may not repent your wickedness. You and I have different ideas on such subjects, but you'll certainly repent your foolishness. When you are eaten up with jealousy of David, you'll wish you had behaved decently. I know what I'm talking about." She paused, looking down at her fingers picking nervously at the back of the chair. "I've been jealous," she said in a low voice. Then, with a quick breath, "However, wicked or foolish, or both, it's done, and I'm not going to waste my time talking about it." "You're very kind," he said. He was so bewildered by this unexpected mildness that he could not think what to say next. "I very much appreciate your overlooking my not telling you about it before I did it. The fact was," he began to stammer. Her face was not reassuring. "The fact was, it was all so hurried. But she was not listening. "You say you mean to go to Europe. How?" "How?" he repeated. "I don't know just what you mean. Of course I shall be sorry to leave the works, but under the circumstances. It costs money to go to Europe. Have you got any?" "My salary." "How can you have a salary when you don't do any work?" Blair was silent. Then he said, frowning, something about his mother's always having been so kind. "Kind?" she broke in. "You call it kind? Well, Blair, I am going to be kind now another way. So far as I'm concerned, you'll not have $1 that you don't earn." He looked perfectly uncomprehending. "I've done being kind, in the way that's ruined you, and made you a useless fool. I'm going to try another sort of kindness. You can work, my son, or you can starve." Her face quivered as she spoke. "What do you mean?" Blair said, quietly. His embarrassment fell from him like a slipping cloak. He was suddenly and ruthlessly a man. She told him what she meant. "This business of your marrying Elizabeth isn't the important thing. That's just a symptom of your disease. It's the fact of your being the sort of man you are, that's important." Blair was silent. Then Sarah Maitland began her statement of the situation as she saw it. She told him just what sort of a man he was: indolent, useless, helpless, selfish. "Until now I've always said that at any rate you were harmless. I can't say even that now." She tried to explain that when a man lives on money he has not earned, he incurs, by merely living, a debt of honor, that God will collect. But she did not know how to say it. Instead, she told him he was a parasite, which loathsome truth was like oil on the flames of his slowly gathering rage. He was a man, she said, whose business in life was to enjoy himself. She tried to make clear to him that after youth, perhaps even after childhood, enjoyment, as the purpose of effort, was dwarfing. "You are sort of a dwarf, Blair," she said, with curiously impersonal brutality. Any enjoyment, she insisted, that was worthy of a man, was only a byproduct, as you might call it, of effort for some other purpose than enjoyment. "One of our puddlers enjoys doing a good job, I guess, but that isn't why he does it," she said, shrewdly. "Any man whose sole effort was to get pleasure is, considering what kind of a world we live in, a poor creature. That's the best that can be said for him," she said. "As for the worst, we won't go into that. You know it even better than I do." Then she told him that his best, which had been harmlessness, and his worst, which they would not go into, were both more her fault than his. It was her fault that he was such a poor creature, a pitiless creature. "I've made you so," she said. She stopped, her face moving with emotion. "I've robbed you of incentive. I see that now. Any man who has the need of work taken away from him is robbed. I guess enjoyment is all that is left for him. I ask your pardon." Her humility was pitiful, but her words were outrageous. "You are young yet," she said. "I think what I am going to do will cure you. If it doesn't, God knows what will become of you." It was the cure of the surgeon's knife, ruthless, radical. It was, in fact, kill or cure. She knew that. "Of course it's a gamble," she admitted, and paused, nibbling at her finger. "A gamble. But I've got to take it." She spoke of it as she might of some speculative business decision. She looked at him as if imploring comprehension, but she had to speak as she thought, with sledgehammer directness. "It takes brains to make money, I know because I've made it, but any fool can inherit it, just as any fool can accept it. I'm going to give you a chance to develop some brains. You can work or you can starve. Or," she added simply, "you can beg. You have begged practically all your life, thanks to me." If only she could have said it all differently. But alas, yearning over him with agonized consciousness of her own wrongdoing, and with singular justice in regard to his, she approached his selfish heart as if it were one of her own blooms, and she a great engine which could mold and squeeze it into something of value to the world. She flung her iron facts at him, regardless of the bruises they must leave upon that most precious thing, his self-respect. Well, she was going to stop her work of destruction, she said. Then she told him how she proposed to do it. He had had everything, and he was nothing. Now he should have nothing, so that he might become something. There was a day, many years ago, when this mother and son, standing together, had looked at the fierce beauty of molten iron. Then she had told him of high things hidden in the seething and shimmering metal, of dreams to be realized, of splendid toils, of vast ambitions. And as she spoke, a spark of vivid understanding had leaped from his mind to hers. Now, her iron will, melted by the fires of love, was seething and glowing, dazzlingly bright in the white heat of complete self-renunciation. It was ready to be poured into a torturing mold to make a tool with which he might save his soul. But no spark of understanding came into his angry eyes. She did not pause for that. His agreement was a secondary matter. The habit of success made her believe that she could achieve the impossible, namely, save a man's soul in spite of himself. Make, as she had told Robert Ferguson, a man of her son. She would have been glad to have his agreement, but she would not wait for it. Blair listened in absolute silence. "Do I understand," he said when she had finished, "that you mean to disinherit me?" "I mean to give you the finest inheritance a young man can have, the necessity for work. And work for the necessity. For, of course, your job is open to you in the office. But it will be at an honest salary after this, the salary any other unskilled man would get." "Please make yourself clear," he said laconically. "You propose to leave me no money when you die?" "Exactly. May I ask how you expect me to live?" "The way most decent men live, by work. You can work, or else, as I said, you can starve. There's a verse in the Bible. You don't know your Bible very well. Perhaps that's one reason you have turned out as you have, but there's a verse in the Bible that says if a man won't work, he shan't eat. That's the best political economy I know. But I never thought of it before," she said simply. "I never realized that the worst handicap a young man can have in starting out in life is a rich father or mother. Ferguson used to tell me so, but somehow I never took it in." "So," he said, he was holding his cane in both hands, and as he spoke he struck it across his knees, breaking it with a splintering snap. "So, you'll disinherit me because I married the girl I love?" "No," she said, eager to make herself clear. "No, not at all. Don't you understand? My God, how can I make him understand? I disinherit you to make a man of you, so that your father won't be ashamed of you, as I am. Yes, I owe it to your father to make a man of you, if it can be done." She rose, with a deep breath, and stood for an instant silent, her big hands on her hips, her head bent. Then, solemnly, "That is all. You may go, my son." Blair got onto his feet with a loud laugh, a laugh singularly like her own. "Well," he said, "I will go. And I'll never come back. This lets me out. You've thrown me over. I'll throw you over. I think the law will have something to say to this disinheritance idea of yours, but until then, take a job in your works? I'll starve first. So help me God, I'll forget that you are my mother. It will be easy enough, for the only womanly thing about you is your dress, She winced, and flung her hand across her face as if he had struck her. If I can forget that I am your son, starvation will be a cheap price. We've always hated each other, and it's a relief to come out into the open and say so. No more gush for either of us. He actually looked like her, as he hurled his insults at her. He picked up his coat and left the room. He was trembling all over. She, too, began to tremble. She looked after him as he slammed the door, half rose, bent over and lifted the splintered pieces of his cane, then sat down, as if suddenly weak. She put her hands over her face. There was a broken sound from behind them. That night she came into Nanny's parlor and told her, briefly, that she meant to disinherit Blair. She even tried to explain why, according to her judgment, she must do so. But Nanny, appalled and crying, was incapable of understanding. Oh, Mama, don't say such things. Tell Blair you take it back. You don't mean it. I know you don't. Disinherit Blair? Oh, it isn't fair. Mama, please forgive him, please. My dear, said Sarah Maitland patiently, it isn't a question of forgiving Blair. I'm too busy trying to forgive myself. Nanny looked at her in bewilderment. Well, we won't go into that, said Mrs. Maitland. You wouldn't understand. What I came over to say, especially, was that if things can go back into the old ways I shall be glad. I reckon Blair won't want to see me for a while, but if Elizabeth will come to the house as she used to, I shan't rake up unpleasant subjects. She is your brother's wife, and shall be treated with respect in my house. Tell her so. Night. But Nanny, with a soft rush across the room, darted in front of her and stood with her back against the door, panting. Mama, wait. You must listen to me. Her stepmother paused, looking at her with mild astonishment. She was like another creature, a little wild creature standing at bay to protect its young. You have no right, Nanny said sternly, you have no right, Mother, to treat Blair so. Listen to me. It was not nice in him to run away with Elizabeth. I know that, though I think it was more her fault than his. But it wasn't wicked. He loved her. My dear, I haven't said it was wicked, Blair's mother tried to explain. In fact, I don't think it was. It wasn't big enough to be wicked. No, it was only a dirty, contemptible trick. Nanny cringed back, her hand gripping the knob behind her. If Blair had been a hardworking man, knocking up against other hardworking men, trying to get food for his belly and clothes for his nakedness, he'd have been ashamed to play such a trick. He'd have been a man. If I had loved him more, I'd have made a man of him. I'd have made work real to him, not make-believe, as I did. And I wouldn't have been ashamed of him, as I am now. I think, said Nanny, with one of those flashes of astuteness so characteristic of the simple mind, that a man would fall in love just as much if he were poor as if he were rich, and you ought to forgive him, Mama. Mrs. Maitland half smiled. I guess there's no making you understand, Nanny, you are like your own mother. Come, open this door, I've got to go to work. But Nanny still stood with her hand gripping the knob. I must tell you, she said in a low voice, I must not be untruthful to you, Mama, I will give Blair all I have myself. The money my father left me shall be his, and everything I may ever have shall be his. Then she seemed to melt away before her stepmother, and the door banged softly between them. Poor little soul, Sarah Maitland said to herself, smiling, as she sat down at her desk in the dining room. Exactly like her mother. I must give her a present. The next day she sent for her general manager and told him what course she had taken with her son. He was silent for a moment, then he said, with an effort, I have no reason to plead Blair's cause, but you're not fair, you know. So Nanny has informed me, she said dryly. Then she leaned back in her chair and tapped her desk with one big finger. Go on. Say what you like. It won't move me one hair. Robert Ferguson said a good deal. He pointed out that she had no right, having crippled Blair, to tell him to run a race. You've made him what he is. Well, it's done, it can't be undone. But you are rushing to the other extreme. You needn't leave him millions, of course, but leave him a reasonable fortune. She meditated. Perhaps a very small allowance, in fact, to make my will sound I may have to. I must find out about that. But while I'm alive, not 1 cent. I never expected to be glad his father died before he was born, and so didn't leave him anything, but I am. No, sir. My son can earn what he wants or he can go without. I've got to do my best to make up to him for all the harm I've done him, and this is the way to do it. Now, the next thing is to make my will sound. He says he'll contest it. She gave her grunt of amusement. Pity I can't see him do it. I'd like the fun of it. It will be cast iron. If there was any doubt about it, I would realize on every security I own tomorrow and give it all away in one lump, now, while I'm alive, if I had to go hungry myself afterward. Will you ask Howe and Marston to send their Mr. Marston up here to draw up a new will for me? I want to go to work on it tonight. I've thought it out pretty clearly, but it's a big job, a big job. I don't know myself exactly how much I'm worth, how much I'd clean up to, at any rate. But I've got a list of charities on my desk as long as your arm. Nanny will be the residuary legatee. She has some money from her father, too, though not very much. The works didn't amount to much when my husband was alive. He divided his share between Nanny and me. She paused, reddening faintly with that strange delicacy that lay hidden under the iron exterior. He didn't know Blair was coming along. Well, I suppose Nanny will give Blair something. In fact, she as good as warned me. Think of Nanny giving me notice. But as I say, she won't have any too much herself. And, Mr. Ferguson, I want to tell you something. I'm going to give David some money now. I mean in a year or two. A lot. Robert Ferguson's face darkened. David doesn't take money very easily. Mrs. Maitland did not ask him to explain. She was absorbed in the most tremendous venture of her life, the saving of her son, and her plan for David was comparatively unimportant. She put through the business of her will with extraordinary dispatch and precision, and with a ruthlessness toward Blair that took her lawyer's breath away. But she would not hear one word of protest. Your business, sir, is to see that this instrument is unbreakable, she said, not to tell me how to leave my money. The day after the will was executed, she went to Philadelphia. I am going to see David, she told her general superintendent. I want to get this affair off my mind so I can settle down to my work, but I've got to square things up first with him. You'll have to run the shop while I'm off. She had written to David briefly, without preface or apology. Dear David, come and see me at the Gerard House Tuesday morning at 7:45 o'clock. Chapter 24. Nearly 2 months had passed since that dreadful day when David Ritchie had gone to his mother to be comforted. In his journey back across the mountains, his mind and body were tense with anticipation of the letter which he was confident was awaiting him in Philadelphia. He was too restless to lie down in his berth. Once he went into the day coach and wandered up and down the aisle between the rows of huddled and uncomfortable humanity. Sometimes a sleepy passenger, hunched up on a plush seat, would swear at him for jostling a protruding foot, and once a drearily crying baby, propped against a fat and sleeping mother, clutched with dirty fingers at his coat. At that little feeble pull he stopped and looked down at the small, wobbling head, then bent over and lifted the child, straightening its rumpled clothes and cuddling it against his shoulder. The baby gurgled softly in his ear, and instantly he remembered the baby he had seen on the raft the night that he first knew he was in love with Elizabeth. When he went back to the smoking compartment and sat down, his hands deep in his pockets, his head sunk between his shoulders, his hat pulled down over his eyes, he thought of that raft baby and wondered if it were alive. But such thoughts were only in the moments when his bruised mind could not steady itself on what had happened to him. Most of the time he was saying, over and over, just what he was going to do the next morning. He would get into the station, take a cab, drive to the hospital. A dozen times that night his thumb and finger sought his waistcoat pocket for a bill to hasten the driver of that cab. Leap out, run up the stairs to the mail rack beside the receiving clerk's desk, seize Elizabeth's letter. Here the pause would come, the moment when his body relaxed, and something seemed to melt within him. Suppose the letter was not there? Very well, back to the cab. Another tip, hurry, hurry, hurry. His mother's house, the steps, his key in the lock. Again and again his fingers closed on the key ring in his pocket. Letters on the hall table awaiting him, her letter. Then again the relaxing shock, suppose it was not there? The thought turned him sick. After the almost physical recoil from it, came brief moments of longing for his mother's tender arms, or the remembrance of that baby on the raft. But almost immediately his mind would return to the treadmill of expectation. Get into the station, take a cab, rush. So it went, on and on, until, toward dawn, through sheer exhaustion he slept. That next day was never very clear in David's memory. Only one fact stood out distinctly in the mists. there was no letter. Afterward, when he tried to recall that time of discovering that she had not written, he was confused by the vision of his mother smiling down at him from the head of the stairs and calling to an unseen maid, "Bring the doctor a cup of coffee, Mary." He could remember that he stood sorting out the letters on the hall table, running them over swiftly, then going through them slowly, one by one, scanning each address, each postmark, then, with shaking hands, shuffling and sorting them like a pack of cards, and going through them again. She had not written. He could remember that he heard the blood beating in his ears, and at the same time his mother's voice, "Bring the doctor a cup of coffee." She had not written. For months afterward, when he tried to recall that morning, the weak feeling in his knees, the way the letters that were not from her shook in his hand, the sound of his mother's joyous voice, these things would come into his mind together. They were all he could remember of the whole day, the day when the grave closed over his youth. After that came hours of expectation, of telegrams back and forth, "Have you heard where they are?" And no news. Weeks of letters between Robert Ferguson and his mother. "It is what I have always said, she is her mother's daughter." And, "Oh, don't be so hard on her and on her poor, bad mother. Find out where she is and go and see her." And, "I will never see her. I am done with her." But among all the letters, never any letter from Elizabeth to David. In those first days he seemed to live only when the mail arrived, but his passion of expectation was speechless. Indeed, his inarticulateness was a bad factor when it came to recovery from the blow that had been dealt him. At the moment when the wound was new, he had talked to his mother, but almost immediately he retreated into silence. And in silence the worst things in his nature began to grow. Once he tried to write to Elizabeth. The letter commenced with frantic directions to come to his mother, at once. Then his pen faltered. Perhaps she did not care to come? Perhaps she did not wish to leave him, and the unfinished letter was flung into the fire. With suspicion of Elizabeth came a contemptuous distrust of human nature in general, and a shrinking self-consciousness, both entirely foreign to him. He was not only crushed by loss, but he was stinging with the organic mortification of the man who has not been able to keep his woman. It was then that Helena Richie first noticed a harshness in him that frightened her, and a cynical individualism that began to create its own code of morals, or at any rate of responsibilities. But before he shut himself into all this misery, not only of loss, but of suspicion and humiliation, he did say one thing. "I'm not going to howl. You needn't be afraid. I shall do my work. You won't hear me howl." There were times when she wished he would. She wished it especially when Robert Ferguson wrote that Elizabeth and Blair were going to return to Mercer, that they would live at the River House, and that it was evident that the annulment, to which at first David's mind had turned so incessantly, was not being thought of. "I understand from Miss White, of course I haven't heard from her written to Mrs. Blair Maitland, that she does not wish to take any steps for a separation," Elizabeth's uncle wrote. "He must see her when she gets back," Helena Richie said, softly, but David said nothing at all. At that moment his suspicion became a certainty. Yes, she had loved the fellow. It had been something else than one of her fits of fury. It had been love. No wonder, with this poison working in him, that he shut even his mother out of his heart. At times the pitying tenderness of her eyes was intolerable to him. He thought he saw the same pity in everybody's eyes. He felt sure that every casual acquaintance was thinking of what had happened to him. He said to himself he wished to God people would mind their business, and let him mind his. "I'm not howling," he told himself. He was like a man whose skin has been taken off. He winced at everything, but all the same, he did his work in the hospital with exhausting thoroughness. To be sure, he gave his patients nothing but technical care. Whether they lived or died was nothing to David. Whether he himself lived or died was still less to him, except, perhaps, that in his own case he had a preference. But work is the only real sedative for grief, and the suffering man worked himself callous, so he had dull moments of forgetfulness, or at any rate of comparative indifference. Yet when he received that note from Mrs. Maitland summoning him to her hotel, he flinched under the callousness. However, at a little before 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning, he knocked at her bedroom door. The Gerard house knew Sarah Maitland's eccentricities as well as her credit. She always asked for a cheap room, and was always put up under the roof. She had never learned to use her money for her own comfort, so it never occurred to her to have a parlor for herself. Her infrequent callers were always shown up here to the top of the house. On this special morning she had come directly from the train, and when David arrived she was pacing up and down the narrow room, haggard and disheveled from a night in the sleeping car. She had not even taken off her bonnet. She turned at his step and stopped short in her tracks. He was so thin, so grim, so old. "Well, David," she said, then hesitated, for there was just an instant's recoil in David. He had not realized the fury that would leap up and scorch him like a flame at the sight of Blair's mother. "David, you'll shake hands with me, won't you?" she said timidly. At the sound of her voice his anger died out. Only the cold ashes of misery were left. "Why, Mrs. Maitland," he protested, and took her big, beautiful, unsteady hand in both of his. For a moment neither of them spoke. It was a dark, cold morning. Far below them stretched the cheerless expanse of snow-covered roofs. From countless chimneys smoke was rising heavily to the lowering sky, and soot was sifting down. The snow on the windowsill was speckled with black. Below, in the courtyard of the hotel, ice carts rumbled in and out, and milk cans were banged down on the cobblestones. A dull day, an empty sky, a futile interview, up here in this wretched little room under the eaves. David wondered how soon he could get away. "David," Mrs. Maitland said, "I know I can't make it up to you in any way. But I'd like to." "You are very kind," he said coldly, "but we won't go into that, if you please, Mrs. Maitland." "No, we won't talk about it," she said, with evident relief, "but David, I came to Philadelphia to say that I want you to let me be of help to you in some way." "Help to me?" he repeated, surprised. "I really don't see." "Why," she explained, "you want to begin to practice. You don't want to drudge along at a hospital under some big man's thumb. I want to set you up." David smiled involuntarily. "But the hospital is my greatest chance, Mrs. Maitland. I'm lucky to have these 3 years there. But it's kind in you to think of giving me a hand." "Nonsense," she said, quite missing the force of what he said. "You ought to put out your own shingle. David, you can have all the money you need, it's yours to take." David started as if she had struck him. "Yours to take?" Oh, that had been said to him before. "No, I can't, I couldn't take money. You don't understand. I couldn't take money from anybody," he said with a gasp. She looked at him helplessly, then stretched out her empty hands. "David," she said pitifully, "money is all I've got. Won't you take it?" The tears were on her cheeks and the big, empty hands shook. "I haven't got anything but money, David," she entreated. His face quivered. He said some broken, protesting word, then suddenly he put his arms round her and kissed her. Her grey head, in the battered old bonnet, rested a moment on his shoulder, and he felt her sob. "Oh, David," she said, "what shall I do? He hates me. He said the only womanly thing about me was, oh, can I make a man of him, do you think?" She entirely forgot David's wrongs in her cry for comfort, a cry that somehow penetrated to his benumbed heart, for in his effort to comfort her he was himself vaguely comforted. For a minute he held her tightly in his arms until he was sure he could command himself. When he let her go, she put her hand up in a bewildered way and touched her cheek. The boy had kissed her. But by that time she was able to go back to the purpose that had brought her here. She told him to sit down and then began, dogmatically, to insist upon her plan. David smiled a little as he explained that, quite apart from any question of income, the hospital experience was valuable to him. "I wouldn't give it up, Mrs. Maitland, if I had $1 million. He said, with a convincing exaggeration that was like the old David. "But it's mighty kind in you. Please believe I do appreciate your kindness." "No kindness about it," she said impatiently. "My family is in your debt, David." At which he hardened instantly. "Well," she said, and was silent for a while, biting her finger and looking down at her boots. Suddenly, with a grunt of satisfaction, she began to hit the arm of her chair softly with her closed fist. "I've got it," she said. "I suppose you wouldn't refuse the trusteeship of a fund, one of these days, to build a hospital? Near my works, maybe? I'm all the time having accidents. I remember once getting a filing in my eye, and somebody suggested a doctor to take it out. A doctor for a filing. I guess you'd have been equal to that job, young as you are? Still, it wouldn't be bad to have a doctor round, even if he was young, if anything serious happened. Yes, a hospital near the works, first for my men and then for outsiders. It is a good idea." I suppose you wouldn't refuse to run such a hospital, and draw your wages, like a man? Well, no, I wouldn't refuse that, he said, smiling. It was many weeks since David had smiled so frankly. A strange thing had happened in that moment when he had forgotten himself in trying to comfort Blair's mother. His corroding suspicion of Elizabeth seemed to melt away. In its place was to come, a little later, the dreadful but far more bearable pain of enduring remorse for his own responsibility for Elizabeth's act. But just then, when he tried to comfort that poor mother, there was only a breaking of the ice about his own heart in a warm gush of pity for her. I don't see that there's much chance of funds for hospitals coming my way, he said, smiling. You never can tell, said Mrs. Maitland. Chapter 25. The morning Blair heard his sentence from his mother, Elizabeth spent in her parlor in the hotel, looking idly out of the window at the tawny current of the river covered with its slipping sheen of oil. Steamboats were pushing up and down or nosing into the sand to unload their cargoes. She could hear the creak of hawsers, the bang of gangplanks thrown across to the shore, the cries and songs of stevedores sweating and toiling on the wharf that was piled with bales of cotton, endless blue barrels of oil, and black avalanches of coal. She did not think of Blair's ordeal. She was not interested in it. She was not interested in anything. Sometimes she thought vaguely of the letter which had never been and would never be written to David, and sometimes of that message from him which she had not yet been able to hear from Miss White's lips, but for the most part she did not think of anything. She was tired of thinking. She sat huddled in a chair, staring dully out of the window. She was like a captive bird, moping on its perch, its poor bright head sinking down into its tarnished feathers. She was so absorbed in the noise and confusion of traffic that she did not hear a knock. When it was repeated, she rose listlessly to answer it, but before she reached the door it opened, and her uncle entered. Elizabeth backed away silently. He followed her, but for a moment he was silent, too. It seemed to Robert Ferguson as if youth had been wiped out of her face. Under the shock of the change in her, he found for a moment nothing to say. When he spoke his voice trembled with anger, she thought. Mrs. Ritchie wrote me that I must come and see you. I told her I would have nothing to do with you. Elizabeth sat down without speaking. I don't see what good it does to come, he said, staring at the tragic face. Of course you know my opinion of you. She nodded. So why should I come? I don't know. Well, I'm here. And you may come home sometimes, if you want to. Miss White is willing to see you, I believe. Thank you, Uncle Robert. As she spoke, the door of the elevator in the hall clanged shut, and the next moment Blair entered. Chapter 25. The morning Blair heard his sentence from his mother, Elizabeth spent in her parlor in the hotel, looking idly out of the window at the tawny current of the river covered with its slipping sheen of oil. Steamboats were pushing up and down or nosing into the sand to unload their cargoes. She could hear the creak of hawsers, the bang of gangplanks thrown across to the shore, the cries and songs of stevedores sweating and toiling on the wharf that was piled with bales of cotton, endless blue barrels of oil, and black avalanches of coal. She did not think of Blair's ordeal. She was not interested in it. She was not interested in anything. Sometimes she thought vaguely of the letter which had never been and would never be written to David, and sometimes of that message from him which she had not yet been able to hear from Miss White's lips, but for the most part she did not think of anything. She was tired of thinking. She sat huddled in a chair, staring dully out of the window. She was like a captive bird, moping on its perch, its poor bright head sinking down into its tarnished feathers. She was so absorbed in the noise and confusion of traffic that she did not hear a knock. When it was repeated, she rose listlessly to answer it, but before she reached the door it opened, and her uncle entered. Elizabeth backed away silently. He followed her, but for a moment he was silent, too. It seemed to Robert Ferguson as if youth had been wiped out of her face. Under the shock of the change in her, he found for a moment nothing to say. When he spoke his voice trembled with anger, she thought. Mrs. Ritchie wrote me that I must come and see you. I told her I would have nothing to do with you. Elizabeth sat down without speaking. I don't see what good it does to come, he said, staring at the tragic face. Of course you know my opinion of you. She nodded. So why should I come? I don't know. Well, I'm here. And you may come home sometimes, if you want to. Miss White is willing to see you, I believe. Thank you, Uncle Robert. As she spoke, the door of the elevator in the hall clanged shut, and the next moment Blair entered.